The Life and Times of Huey P. Long, and for this video we'll be using 3 books. First, an autobiography by Huey P. Long, Every Man a King. Then, and primarily, a biography on Huey Long called Kingfish, written by Richard D. White, Jr., and Huey Long's book, My First Days in the White House, which was his fantasy book of if and when he became president, how it would go, and some of his policies are written out in this book. So let's get into it. The life of Huey Pierce Long. We start with his birth and youth. Huey Long was born on August 30th, 1893, in Wynn Parish, Louisiana, amid the red clay hill country dotted with longleaf pine, and where a dark and relentless poverty sapped the lives of the straight-laced Baptists who struggled to survive there. Huey recalls an experience from youth which he thought to be his first witnessing of injustice taking place. He says, "I must have been about 8 years old when I saw the first sheriff's sale, which I remember. By that time, a railroad had been built into the community. A farmer's place was to be auctioned off by the sheriff for a debt owed to a store. Before the sale, standing on the steps of the courthouse, this farmer begged the crowd not to bid for his home. He pled that it would be taking it away from his children, that if given time to raise another crop, he could pay his debts. No one in the crowd offered a bid. The creditor remained silent until the sheriff was about ready to declare no sale, when he took courage and made his bid. The poor farmer was out. I was horrified. I could not understand. It seemed criminal. This marked the first sign in my recollection of a neighborhood where the blessing of the Creator were shared one with another, being transformed into a community yielding to commercial enticements." Huey's mother, Caldonia, like his father, came from Pennsylvania Dutch stock, a slender, hazel-eyed, and raven-haired woman who weighed less than 100 pounds. Caldonia was disciplined, self-educated, and had a photographic memory that Huey would inherit. And of his own ethnic makeup, Huey says, "Perhaps I can qualify as a product of the melting pot in my veins. There flows blood of English, Dutch, Welsh, Irish, Scot-French forebears." Back to his mother, she insisted her children read the Bible and attend the First Baptist Church of Winfield. She had a preacher baptize Huey in a neighbor's fish pond, but the boy rebelled against his Baptist upbringing. Caldonia, who refused to whip her children, tried to manage Huey, the most unruly and headstrong of her 9 offspring. But her efforts proved futile. Even before he could walk, he demanded that he control everything and everyone around him. Always inquisitive as a toddler, he wandered off and on one occasion crawled beneath a steam locomotive and delayed the train departing from Winfield Station. As a rebellious teenager, he smoked, drank, chewed tobacco, and cussed like a field hand. Caldonia passed her charitable spirit to Huey. Known throughout the parish as a generous and compassionate woman, she frequently sent her son to deliver food and clothing to the less fortunate families. Of the 4 Long brothers and 5 sisters, 3 of the boys became attorneys, and the 4th, George, a dentist and later a congressman. And the girls received degrees in education from Louisiana Normal College, one becoming a professor. So from a very early age, he's involved, through his mother, with charity and helping people, especially the destitute, and this, you could see, impacted his later political career. While in high school, Huey learned to set type and wrote short items for 2 local newspapers, the Baptist Monthly Guardian and the Southern Sentinel. When he was a junior, he competed on his high school debate team that traveled to Louisiana State University for the state rally. While in Baton Rouge, Huey stayed at the home of T.H. Harris, the state superintendent of education. The boy was a perfect portrait of what men to follow, says T.H. Harris. Huey never had much patience for school. In 1910, just before his 17th birthday, Winfield High School expelled him. He was already showing an obsession to be in charge and to control those around him. We had formed a secret society. We wore a red ribbon, he recalled later. He belonged to a sort of circle that was to run things, laying down certain rules the students would have to follow. If the students obeyed faculty rules, then Huey and his followers kept them off the baseball team or the debating team. The faculty told Huey that his antics were out of order, but he continued to defy their authority. After he published a circular attacking the teachers, the principal expelled him. Even after being expelled, he did not give up. He hand-delivered a petition around Winfield and convinced the majority of the citizens to sign it. They fired the principal. Huey did not try to finish high school. He left Winfield in July and took a job as a traveling salesman selling cottolene, a lard substitute made from cottonseed oil. His salary was $19 a week. He traveled across the South, hawking his product and distributing pie plates and cookbooks and holding baking contests in cities and towns. So all the qualities that would come to serve him in the future are there with him in his youth. I mean, he's aggressive. He has the gift of gab. I mean, just think about this kid running around town signing a petition to get the principal fired, all out of revenge for the principal expelling him. And that was another aspect Huey was great at, getting revenge. And you could see, even as a youth, he had that quality. Selling cottolene door to door, Huey soon became a persistent and skillful salesman who combined his wit and outgoing personality with iron-willed determination to make a sale. In late September 1911, Huey's mother persuaded him to move to Shawnee, Oklahoma, where his older brother George was a dentist. Caledonia always wanted Huey to become a minister and managed to convince him to enter Oklahoma Baptist University. He lasted only one semester, rarely attended classes, and confessed to his brother that he was not cut out to be a preacher. He decided to become a lawyer. With $100 provided by George, Huey headed for law school at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. On the way, however, he spent New Year's Eve in Oklahoma and lost his money at a roulette wheel of a local gambling parlor. The next morning, he wandered the streets broke, and on an impulse, walked into the offices of the Dawson Produce Company. Huey introduced himself and asked to be hired as a salesman to work the Norman area while he attended law school. His brassy confidence impressed the manager, K.W. Dawson, who gave him a job at 5% commission. Huey needed to get from Oklahoma City to Norman, but did not have the cash for a train ticket. At 9 that night, with the thermometer dipping near zero and a wind howling across the plains of Oklahoma that cut like a knife, he began walking. 5 hours later, at 2 in the morning, he finished the 18-mile trek and arrived chilled to the bone in Norman. For the following semester, Huey attended law school part-time and sold fruit and vegetables for Dawson. He showed up only for a few classes and quit selling groceries the following May. He received 3 C's and an incomplete in the 4 courses he took. He also continued to gamble, spending most of his weekends in Oklahoma City at the dice and poker tables. "I didn't learn much law there," Huey recalled years later. "Too much excitement, all those gambling houses and everything." Years later, during campaign speeches in remote regions of the state, Huey would point to a former customer in the crowd and tease him for losing his hair or gaining a few pounds. And that's that picture memory there. To recall someone he door-to-door sold something to years later as he's campaigning for governor or something. In October 1910, while still selling cottolene and holding baking contests to advertise his product, 19-year-old Huey Long spotted a petite, dark-eyed, black-haired young woman among the 700 contestants who entered a bake-off in Shreveport's West End neighborhood. Rose McConnell had baked a bride loaf cake made with sugar, flour, egg whites, vanilla, milk, and of course 2/3 of a cup of cottolene. Taking a liking to her, he ensured she won first prize. During his Christmas vacation of 1912, Huey returned to Shreveport to visit Rose and to propose to her. She turned him down, but he persisted, writing her constantly. Finally, during the following spring, she relented and on April 12, 1913, took the train to Memphis where he was living. The couple married there in a small ceremony at the Greoso Hotel. Huey borrowed $10 from Rose to pay the Baptist minister. His brother Julius suggested Huey return to his law studies. Julius, who received a law degree from Tulane after a year of study, persuaded him to follow the same path. Throwing all of his energy into law, he dropped to a weight of 112 pounds and couldn't sleep. I would read until about 5 or 10 minutes after midnight, Huey remembered. And then I would trot about half a mile up to a little beer stand, get a half-gallon of beer, and come back and drink that beer and lie down and slide off to sleep that way. By April 1915, Huey felt he had learned enough law, and besides, he was broke. By then, he had completed only 2 Tulane law courses, corporation law and federal practice. He failed 2 other courses and did not show up for the final exam in 4 others. His lackluster academic record, however, did not reflect his overall energy. He cared less about the formal academic grades than in learning practical applications of the law. Whenever I saw one of those professors leave the school and go to town, Huey recalled, I would get on a streetcar with him and I would talk law to him all the way to town. He posed detailed, realistic questions in class and cornered professors in the hallways to quiz them on the finer points. When the bell rang, he always had one more question to ask, a classmate remembered. The bar exam was scheduled in June, but Huey was impatient and penniless. Instead of waiting a month, he petitioned the Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court, Judge Frank Monroe, to take the bar exam early. Yielding to the irrepressible law student, Monroe allowed an unusual special exam to be administered. On May 15th, Huey went before the panel of attorneys and passed his oral bar exam with little difficulty. Now the 21-year-old member of the Louisiana bar, he climbed aboard a train that evening and headed back to Winfield, with only enough money in his pocket to pay for his ticket. So we see Huey has this drive and this will to get things done, and even failing in school, doing bad academically, he is largely self-taught. He picks the brains of the people who know better, asking the questions he needs to know that he thinks is important. And even though he can't deal with or doesn't want to deal with the structure of the university, he is able to take the bar early and pass it with flying colors. So first to convince the judge to give the bar to him early, and then to pass it with flying colors, it's just like him getting his principal fired. So we see Huey at his young age is not your average person. And hence why later he essentially becomes a dictator of a state in a country that hates and fears even the thought of a dictator. And possibly would have become president if he was not assassinated. Okay, we continue on as he's a lawyer and starts dabbling into politics. As a young lawyer, Huey was exactly what he was as a politician, a champion for the poor. He took cases where at times people could not even pay him, often representing the little man against big business. Huey began to ruffle some feathers as that lawyer who was always attacking the corporations. He became known as the lawyer who would treat both big and small cases with the same energy. For instance, he speaks of his most hard-fought case. One of the hardest fought cases I ever had was for $22.50. It was tried in 3 courts, finally reaching the Supreme Court, involving costs and expenses of several $100s. I finally won it. The case was Shreveport Mill and Elevator Company versus John Stoller. The amount involved was $22.50. The Supreme Court in the case held where the merchant, having contracted to furnish to a baker hard wheat flour of a certain brand, ships flour of another brand, representing it to be of the same grade as the brand ordered, and the baker uses only enough of it to find out that it is an inferior grade. He is not required to pay for the portion which he used in testing the flour, and which proved to be of no value to him. So they had to take that simple case all the way up the ladder to the Supreme Court. I guess the business supplying the flour was pretty adamant in their defense and not wanting to pay. But eventually, like he said, they won it, and it was just simply for $22 worth of flour. Okay, politics eventually came into it, especially when the young lawyer would openly challenge the established power. It became apparent that arguing in court would not be enough. He had to get into the political process to bring about true change. He says, I was 24 years of age. Through a careful perusal of state constitution, I found that there was no minimum age limit prescribed for a railroad commissioner. I was therefore eligible for election. 5 candidates, including myself, entered the race for railroad commissioner from the North Louisiana district in the summer of 1918. So he tries a lot of these cases against big business, and he kind of sees the same thing and says, well, maybe you can win some cases and get some money and some justice for the little man here and there, but you're really not going to change the game like that unless you get into politics. And that was his mindset. So he was too young at that age to, run for governor or things like that. So he found one of the only positions he can get into and ran for that in 1918. The Louisiana Railroad Commission regulated interstate railroads, pipelines, and public utilities, and was one of the most powerful bodies in the state. To Huey Long, the commission was the perfect place for him to run for his first public office and launch his political career. In 1918, 10 years before he became governor, 25-year-old Huey entered the race for railroad commissioner representing the 28 parishes of North Louisiana. He says, I ran second, some 2,000 votes behind the incumbent, in the first primary. A second primary was ordered and was soon on in full force. The final reports of the contest gave me a majority of 636 votes. My opponent congratulated me upon my victory. I thus became railroad commissioner just as I entered the age of 25. Immediately following the second primary, I announced a change of residence from Winfield to Shreveport. I had done certain legal work for some of my Winfield friends connected to the oil business in the Caddo parish, of which Shreveport is the parish seat. They paid me in oil stock. I bought additional stock from some of them. Several companies in which I was interested were very successful. We finally had a very large concern, which gave promise to becoming an even larger affair. It was just at this time the big companies threatened to begin pipeline embargoes designed to freeze out small companies and independent operators. This is something the enemies of Huey Long often bring up, that his battles with the multinational corporations like Standard Oil was simply to fatten his own pocket, while indeed, the more local oil processing centers were used, the better it would be for a stockholder like Huey, but also the better it would be for the state of Louisiana, the people of Louisiana, as well as better for Americans in general, as Standard Oil was having oil shipped in from Mexico at a lesser cost. The capitalist way, of course. Before Huey became a member, the Railroad Commission had been a stagnant 3-member body that was slave to the state's wealthy interests. As soon as he took office, Huey rebelled against the wealthy businessmen who had controlled the commission's decisions and demanded that the freight rates be lowered to help the small farmers. After he became commission chairman in 1922, he injected new energy and independence into the agency, later renamed the Public Service Commission. During his tenure, he worked to increase the commission's and his own power. He crusaded for lower utility rates, forced the railroads to extend their services to small villages and hamlets, and demanded that the Standard Oil Company end the importation of Mexican crude oil and use more oil from Louisiana wells. On my 30th birthday, August 30, 1923, I announced my candidacy for governor in the primary election to be held in January 1924. I had neither newspaper nor organized political support other than my own scattered faction. Neither could I get a favorable or complimentary mention by any of the newspapers, which gave me less than no credit for anything I had done up to that time. They warned against the wild activities with which the people might be afflicted should I become governor. I drove my automobile and usually traveled alone, my car loaded with campaign literature and buttons, which I handed out at my meetings before and after speaking. In certain sections of southern Louisiana, Following my speaking engagements, I found it easy to secure permission from the merchants and from the business people to allow me to hang my posters in their show windows. The town usually was placarded following my meeting and as I departed. If, however, I chanced to drive through the same place a few days following, I found the windows cleared of campaign posters altogether. I knew my only chance to keep a poster in the windows was to personally see that it had been placed there. On an occasion in the town of Eunice, Louisiana, 2 speakers assisting in my campaign were with me when I asked a store owner for permission to place a poster in his window. "That'll be all right," the store owner said. "You just leave the poster here and I will put it up myself tomorrow morning." I felt reasonably sure that the poster would be in the trash the next morning rather than in the window. "Well," I insisted, "I've got these 2 men hired to do nothing but hang these posters. They're experts in their line. No use to put you through that kind of trouble. Get in there, fellows, and put up a couple of posters," I instructed. They glued them in the window reasonably secure. I found further that my posters were being taken down from old buildings and trees alongside the road. My sign hanging experience came again into good use. I adopted the art of driving my automobile close to all the trees. From the top I reached with a long hammer as far as possible to hang my campaign poster beyond the reach of any hand. I just switched from his autobiography into the Kingfish biography. On Election Day, January 15th, 1924, a heavy downpour inundated the entire state and lowered the turnout of rural voters who were most likely to vote for Huey. He finished 3rd in the Democratic primary. Henry Fuqua won with 82,556 votes. Hewitt Blanchard got 82,287 votes, and Huey 73,762. Huey carried all the northern parishes except 3 and received majorities in 21 parishes, but his 12,000 votes in New Orleans were not enough. With the New Orleans vote excluded, he would have won. His first campaign was poorly financed and inefficiently run, and he still appeared a little rough around the edges. One day after he lost the 1924 race, Huey bought a new suit and began campaigning again. For the next 4 years, he never slowed down, vowing that his 1928 campaign would be efficiently run and victorious. In his new campaign, he worked hard to build political support across the state. With a pile of "Long for Governor" campaign posters heaped in the backseat of his Ford coupe, Huey crisscrossed Louisiana during the summer and fall of 1927. He crossed lush cypress swamps on rickety bridges and steam ferry boats. When it rained, the unpaved roads he traveled turned into an impassable quagmires. And when it didn't, the scorching sun baked the country lanes into dust-choked paths, cursed with axle-deep, bone-jarring potholes. Journeys across Louisiana tortured both car and driver. But the state's wretched roads did not hold back the headstrong and indefatigable young politician. Huey Long was running for governor and nothing was going to slow him down. Day in and day out, Huey campaigned across the state. He stopped at every crossroad village and country store, buttonholed any farmer or one-horse merchant he spied, and on almost every tree and telephone pole he passed, tacked his campaign poster. In the towns, he dropped by the local barbershop and placed a poster in the window so that men waiting for the haircut had little else to do but stare at Huey's smiling face. On Sundays, he put his circulars into buggies while people were attending church, and sometimes he stopped at a Baptist church during service and asked to sing in the choir. Huey never seemed to stop campaigning, and his unflagging energy attracted attention. All over the neighborhoods flew the news of my working through the nights, he wrote later. When Huey gave the speech in rural parts, he would recognize people in the crowd whom he had met during his salesman days. He would mention that one was getting fatter, or about how so-and-so borrowed $1 from him, recalled a follower. He saw to it he was never a stranger in their midst. When Huey passed through rural parishes, as counties are called in Louisiana, late in the evening, at times he knocked unannounced on a farmer's door and asked to spend the night. Rising early before breakfast, he helped with the chores, washed the dishes, and when he left, paid the family $1. So you can see he's truly a man of the people. Like, he just go in and remember people from his sales day and, kind of heckle them when he's on the stage and mess with them a little bit. in a jovial manner, of course, and then even staying the night with people and helping out. And you see, he's very sociable to his fellow Louisianans, especially the ones in the rural areas, who grew up similar to how he grew up. On a Thursday in the middle of September, a typical day on the campaign trail, Huey canvassed the northeastern parishes of the state. He passed through miles of rolling hill country studded with longleaf and loblolly pine and dotted with small sawmills that turned out rough-cut lumber stacked in glistening piles to dry out in the sun. Starting at 10 that morning, he delivered a rousing 30-minute speech in Delhi, a small lumber town in Richland Parish. He then drove 10 miles north to the village of Epps, where he bellowed another speech at noon, jumped back in his Ford and rushed 40 miles to Forest for a speech at 1, then drove 33 miles to Pioneer for a 2 o'clock speech. From Pioneer, he drove 9 miles to Oak Grove, the West Carroll Parish seat and home of several large cotton gins and a lumber plant, and gave a speech at 3 o'clock in the town square. From there, it was another 11 miles to Kilbourne, just below the border with Arkansas, for a rally at 4:30. After a final 20-mile dash to Lake Providence in East Carroll Parish, Huey delivered his 7th speech at 8 in the evening on the courthouse steps. At each stop, he pumped hands, slapped backs, kissed babies, and entertained his audiences with fire and brimstone. A stiff belt of bourbon provided his only comfort at the end of a long day. Huey Long took devilish delight in shattering political traditions. Before he ran for governor, the Delta planters, wealthy businessmen, and New Orleans political bosses would meet in secret to pick the next Democratic candidate for governor. Louisiana was a one-party state, and the only election that made any difference was the Democratic primary. Even primary elections were of little consequence. However, as the powerful politicos decided the results beforehand and controlled the voting by methods both fair and foul, before Huey, milquetoast candidates waged dull and meaningless gubernatorial campaigns, giving listless speeches that made few promises and when elected carried out fewer. The candidates visited only the larger cities and token parish seats and ignored the rural and impoverished regions of the state. Shunning the support of the political bosses, Huey waged an unorthodox campaign. He was confident that he could get his political support directly from the people and ran his campaign without the blessing of the state's Democratic wheel horses. He spent little time in large courthouse towns and parish seats and focused instead on the scattered people of the hills and hollows. In the past, candidates for governor pursued local political bosses who controlled the voters in their parishes, but Huey did the opposite. In every parish there is a boss, usually the sheriff, he told a friend. The boss has 40% of the votes, 40% are opposed to him, and 20% are the in-betweens. I'm going into every parish and cuss out the boss. That gives me 40% of the votes to begin with, and I will horse trade them out of the in-betweens. I always hit the big man first. He also delivered his attacks by a more unconventional method, becoming the first politician in Louisiana to broadcast his speeches over the radio. By 1928, a large portion of the state's population could sit in their parlors, tune in their polished wooden boxes to the powerful Shreveport station, KWKH, and listen to Huey launch his tirades. On the road, he employed 2 new sound trucks with huge loudspeakers attached to their roofs. One of the sound trucks always stayed ahead of him, arriving in the next town an hour early with music blaring and drumming up a crowd. Huey knew that soapbox speaking was still important in rural Louisiana, where few people read newspapers and political rallies provided rare entertainment. During one of Huey's early campaign trips through the Acadian South, a local political boss warned, "Huey, you ought to remember one thing in your speeches today. You're from North Louisiana, but you're in South Louisiana, and we got a lot of Catholic voters down here." "I know," Huey answered, and for the rest of the day he started his speeches by saying, "When I was a boy, I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, and I would hitch our old horse up to a buggy, and I'd take my Catholic grandparents to Mass. I would bring them home, and at 10 o'clock, I would hitch the old horse up again, and I would take my Baptist grandparents to church. Later that night, the political boss complimented Huey as he headed back to Baton Rouge. "Why, Huey, you've been holding out on us. I didn't know you had any Catholic grandparents." "Don't be a damn fool," shot back Huey. "We didn't even have a horse." His campaign manager, Harvey Ellis, wrote U.S. Senator Ed Broussard and urged him to back Huey. 4 months earlier, Huey campaigned for Broussard. Huey covered the state for Broussard, making 4 speeches a day. Broussard won by 3,479 votes, and the New Orleans Times-Picayune credited the race to Huey. Despite vigorous support for Broussard's re-election, the senator afterward gave him only a weak endorsement, as did the other U.S. Senator, Joseph Ransdell, whose re-election Huey had supported in 1924. In spite of failing to get enthusiastic senatorial support, Huey continued to entice other political heavyweights and wealthy supporters. He was able to raise more campaign funds in 1928 than he had in 1924. Harvey Couch, a utilities and railroad millionaire from North Louisiana, contributed several $1,000s and served as Huey's go-between with the business community. Nicholas Carbajal, a wealthy New Orleans Italian-American, contributed $10,000, and W.K. Henderson, the rich Shreveport ironmonger and Maverick radio station owner, gave $10,000 more, as well as free airtime on his KWKH station, and provided the amplifiers for the sound trucks that rambled across the state announcing Huey's arrival. Huey's cousin, Swartz Lee, a wealthy lumberman, contractor, and political boss from the Rhapsodies Parish, gave $30,000 to the campaign. Colonel Robert Ewing, a wealthy newspaper publisher who saw himself as a political kingmaker, provided a sizable sum, as did the Fisher family, which ran a shrimping empire in South Louisiana. Even Huey's younger brother Earl, now selling shoe polish and hoping for a political appointment, contributed several $1,000s. Huey's biggest financial backer, however, was one Robert Mastry, a son of an Italian immigrant and poultry peddler. Mastry owned huge tracts of property, over 500 houses, many of them on the edge of Storyville, once the city's haven of prostitution. His enemies nicknamed him Red Light Bob because many of his properties rented not by the month but by the hour. Impassive yet amiable and reliable, the rich Italian devoted himself to Huey for years to come. Unlike other contributors, Mastry appeared to expect nothing in return from Huey. Rising out of poverty, he was sympathetic to the underdog, especially one like Huey who challenged the ruling political bosses. Mastry contributed at least $40,000. And reality of the political game, and he learned it in his second campaign for governor, was, you needed money, you needed support, you needed to talk to the business community. So this time, he was able to get a few, well-off people to support him. Huey's 1928 campaign was not only better funded than 1924, it was much better organized. He hired a campaign staff to fill each day's schedule with his speaking events and to spend campaign funds where they mattered most. He kept a huge card catalog of addresses of thousands of his followers across the state and set up a network of his own political bosses in each voting precinct who made sure the people made it to the polls and voted right. At the time, it was customary for Louisiana gubernatorial candidates to campaign alone, but Huey selected his own slate of running mates from different parts of the state. The long ticket included Columbus Reed for Attorney General, John S. Patton for Superintendent of Education, H.B. Connor for Treasurer, Connor a 3-term legislator from Concordia Parish. All these men were die-hard long loyalists. Huey added Cajun support to the slate by putting Paul Sierre, a French Catholic dentist from the heart of Acadiana, on the ticket for lieutenant governor. Sierre was a feisty 200-pounder known as the Wild Bull of Jeanneret. Huey liked having the muscular Sierre near his side in case political gathering turned rowdy and fists began to fly. At the beginning of the 1928 governor's race, the state's political leaders regarded Huey Long as a threat to their entrenched power and no longer dismissed him as a loudmouth upstart. 4 years before, Huey had shocked many observers of Louisiana politics, including the large daily newspapers, with his strong showing. The wealthy Delta cotton planters, sugarcane growers, lumbermen, and New Orleans hard-wheelers detested Huey, and they were determined to fight and defeat him. On July 28, 1927, a blistering hot day, former governors John Parker, Ruffin Pleasant, and J.Y. Sanders, along with representatives of the Standard Oil Company, gathered in Alexandria to select their own gubernatorial hopeful. The New Orleans political machine also attended, traveling from New Orleans in 15 Pullmans. That night, 3,000 citizens sweltered in the same Bolton High School auditorium in which Huey would announce his candidacy. Jammed to the limit of the auditorium, teamed with delegates yelling under a huge banner proclaiming, "It won't be long now." All of the speakers attacked Huey. Former Governor Pleasant called Huey a coward with the conduct of an egg-sucking yellow dog and a man who lives with a craven heart like a white-livered popinjay. Shreveport Mayor Lee Thomas, for years one of Huey's most vitriolic archenemies, threatened to run for governor just to stop him, calling Huey quintoxic. Known as a wet jug due to his bald head and large ears, Heavyset Thomas belonged to the old school fire-breathing politicians. A great many citizens I know are opposed to a man of a destructive and Bolshevik type for governor of this state, declared Thomas. They sincerely believe that the election of Huey Long would be more injurious to the welfare of the state than the locusts of Egypt or the Mississippi floods which have devastated our rich alluvial soil. "One day you'll pick up the papers to see I killed 4 priests," Huey Long joked to the crowd at the Ascension Parish Fair in Donaldsville in 1927. "Another day I murdered 12 nuns, and the next day I poisoned 400 babies. I have not got the time to answer all of them." Everywhere Huey campaigned, the newspapers followed. He made a good copy, and the papers gave him wide coverage, although most of the reporting soundly denounced him. The New Orleans item accused him of making campaign promises he could never keep and pledging himself to cure the blind, the deaf, and the deformed. Huey constantly battled the press. In his unsuccessful 1924 race for governor, he did not have a single Louisiana daily newspaper behind him. And of the more than 100 weeklies, only a handful endorsed him. 4 years later, Huey's relations with the press had not improved, and his constant attacks on the newspaper made them criticize him more intensely. "There is as much honor in the New Orleans item as there is in the heel of a flea," Huey yelled in one speech. So he's taken fake news to task in the 1920s. And this is why there was, during Trump's campaign in 2016, there was some comparison between him and Huey Long for their populist methods and their debate tactics. But Long proved tenfold more to be more principled than the people that hoped Trump would have become a populist. In another, he mockingly portrayed the Alexandria Daily Town Talk as the Alexandria Bladder. On one occasion, Huey's hostility for the newspaper led to fisticuffs. He encountered Dolph Frantz, the editor of the Shreveport Journal, on a Shreveport street. "I'm tired of your lies," Huey yelled at the editor. The men clinched and rolled around from sidewalks into the gutter, reported the New Orleans newspaper. Mr. Frantz was bleeding about the mouth but not seriously hurt when the combatants were separated by bystanders. See, how about those days you go punch a lying editor in his fucking face? We are severely separated from that mentality today as the fake news hides behind the veneer of free press, which, anyone that knows it's not free press when everything's controlled by 6 or 7 companies. Despite his frequent bouts with the press, Huey needed newspaper support to help him win the governorship in 1928. He turned to 2 of his former enemies to get it. One of them, wealthy newspaper publisher Colonel Robert Ewing, had opposed Huey viciously in the governor race of 1924. The 68-year-old newspaperman, son of a wealthy Scottish cotton broker, managed a New Orleans Chronicle at the turn of the century, later bought the New Orleans States and Shreveport Times, and expanded into Monroe Morning World and Monroe News Star. Ewing was affluent, politically connected, wringing wet, and his newspapers covered a large portion of the state. Huey needed Ewing on his side. To win him over, Huey courted the support of Ewing's friend, John Sullivan. Sullivan managed the New Orleans Fairgrounds racetrack and lobbied for the liquor dealers. He also gambled notoriously. 6'2", handsome with wavy hair, Sullivan led the New Regulars, a fractious group of maverick New Orleans politicians who had opposed Huey in his 1924 bid for governor. "To get Ewing, we would have to take Sullivan first," Huey admitted in the middle of 1927. After Huey promised to back Sullivan and reward his new regulars with patronage jobs in New Orleans, Ewing agreed to support Huey's ticket. Ewing and Huey did not like each other, but Ewing believed that if Huey won, he could influence the young, inexperienced governor. Huey's pact with Sullivan disrupted his political camp. In May 1927, Harvey Ellis resigned as campaign manager because of the Long-Sullivan partnership. An upstanding attorney from Mandeville, Ellis tried to run a clean campaign and earlier urged Huey to cut out the rough stuff and send personal notes to influential voters that he offended. Ellis believed that Sullivan was crooked and stood for three things: racing, gambling, and whiskey. Once Sullivan agreed to back Huey, Colonel Ewing's New Orleans States endorsed him in December 1927. The large New Orleans daily papers often chose different candidates during the elections in order to increase controversy and boost circulation. The Times-Picayune, which opposed the New Orleans political bosses, backed Governor Simpson, while both the Item and the Morning Tribune supported Riley Joe Wilson. Because each newspaper gave one-sided coverage to its own candidate and ignored the other two, citizens needed to buy different papers to keep up with the campaigns. Of the state's small weekly papers, only the Hammond Vindicator, Bogalisa News, St. Tammany Farmer, Lafourche Comment, and Donaldsonville Chief endorsed Huey for governor. Dozens of others bitterly fought him. In November, the Huma Courier described one of Huey's speeches as disgusting buffoonery and said that 1,000 people witnessed a cheap vaudeville performance, the chief actor in which, Long, was uncouth in manner and speech, preaching demagoguery of such errant type that almost every utterance was an affront to an intelligent audience. The Shreveport Caucasian ridiculed Huey as the Honorable Huey Promising Long, and thereafter spelled his name in lowercase letters. Promoting his free school books and other benefits, Huey tried to go everywhere and meet everyone. Where he didn't go, he mailed circulars, over 1 million of them during the last 4 months of the campaign, which outlined his platform and attacked his opponents. He personally composed these well-written broadsides, each averaging from 1,000 to 1,800 words. Huey had learned a lot from his unsuccessful bid for governor and now was much more improved candidate 4 years later. His speeches were better written, more focused, and more powerfully delivered than those in 1924. He spoke of practical, tangible goals such as better roads, better education, and free bridges, and provided clear-cut examples of simple statistics that discredited the vague promises offered by his unimaginative opponents. On Sunday night, at the end of August 1927, Huey began his fight to win the New Orleans with a mass meeting at the corner of Canal Street and Claiborne Avenue. 5,000 spectators crowded around and thousands more listened to the speech broadcast across the state by radio. Huey needed New Orleans and worked hard to shore up the city and increase his support. John Sullivan opened the rally, followed by John Overton, a prominent Alexandria lawyer and one of the state's best orators. Huey and Overton had been political allies since 1918, when he stumped for Overton's unsuccessful bid for the U.S. Senate. That same year, Overton helped Huey win his first election as a state railroad commissioner. Attacking Wilson with biting ridicule, Overton accused Prince Riley of being crowned by the political aristocracy of that state and claimed Wilson's platform sounded like a funeral dirge. In a frenzy of red hair and flailing arms, Huey leaped to the rostrum and launched a barrage at the New Orleans political machine. Ignoring his earlier promise not to attack the character of his opponents, he assailed Governor Simpson for claiming the right to be candidate because a man died, a reference to Simpson having succeeded to office when the previous governor died. Huey struck at Simpson's Conservation Commission, where they are hiring men to watch coons on the street of Shreveport and New Orleans. But Huey, who seemed to change unexpectedly from saint to sinner and back again, ended his New Orleans speech on a more inspiring note with a quote from his favorite poem, William Ernest Henley's Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate or how charged with punishment the scroll, he recited passionately. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Filled with musty antique furniture that smelled like wet horsehair, the Choctaw Club was one of New Orleans' seedier private fraternities. A 3-story Creole-style building fringed with filigreed wrought iron balconies, the Choctaw offered no dining room, contained no bar where its patrons could drink highballs, nor provided any of the amenities available at the city's more posh retreats, like the Pickwick or Boston clubs. The Choctaw members were not the fashionable elite from the uptown of Garden District. Instead, they were a rougher crowd, mostly heavy-set, cigar-smoking men who, if necessary, could use their fists to settle their frequent arguments. 1 block down from the mayor's office in marble-columned Gallier Hall on Lafayette Square, the Choctaw served as the true heart of New Orleans politics. The Choctaws, also known as the Old Regulars and the Ring, had served as the Crescent City's most intimidating political machine since 1897. They ran the city crookedly and incompetently, but provided some social service that the state did not. On a scale they resembled New York City's Tammany Hall, the Choctaws dominated New Orleans politics and ruled each of the city's 17 political wards with heavy hands. By the 1920s, the Ring controlled 35,000 votes, according to one observer. If they like you, they would steal the election. Another critic was more blunt, recalling, they were a bunch of bums. Elections were preordained as the Old Regulars selected their own henchmen as voter registrars who padded the rolls generously with the names of dead people, imaginary people, and people who have moved elsewhere but somehow showed up to cast their ballot on election day. Taxing gamblers and prostitutes to fatten their machines' coffers, the Old Regulars controlled a vast patronage stockpile. City policemen, firemen, the street maintenance men all owed them their jobs, and most of the state's government jobs in the city fell within their control. The city sewage and water board alone have over 4,000 jobs, and men got those jobs only with the blessing of the Choctaws. Huey Long knew that he would never win New Orleans until he controlled the political bosses who ran the city. The Choctaws not only held a firm grasp upon New Orleans, but also held the trump card in statewide gubernatorial and congressional elections. The city had 20% of the state's voting population and elected 20 House members and 8 senators. Although few Old Regulars ran for statewide election, they nevertheless widened considerable influence in deciding the state's political future. When the Old Regulars collaborated with the wealthy plantation owners along the fertile Mississippi bottomland, their candidate became nearly unbeatable. From 1900 to 1924, the Choctaws delivered the deciding votes for governors William Hurd, Newton Blanchard, J.Y. Sanders, Ruffin Pleasant, and Henry Fuqua. Any candidate for governor of Louisiana who did not carry New Orleans had little hope of victory, a fact well known to a young upstart politician named Huey Long. It was lunchtime and a crowd of visitors attending a bottlers convention filled the plush lobby of New Orleans Hotel Roosevelt. A group of Orange Crush salesmen were relaxing in the hotel grill after finishing their fried oyster sandwiches when they heard yells and scuffling outside the door. Rushing into the lobby, they were surprised to see an elderly, overweight gentleman grappling with a younger man on the marble floor. Many of the onlookers recognized the two men fighting. The older gentleman was J.Y. Sanders, 60-ish, and former governor of the state. The younger was the red-haired Huey P. Long. So you have someone running for governor getting in a full-out fight with someone that used to be governor. An old-fashioned Southern orator full of cliches about the lost cause and the virtues of white supremacy, Jared Y. Sanders was a household name in Louisiana politics. Supported by New Orleans Ring, he served in the State House of Representatives from 1892 to 1904, as lieutenant governor from 1904 to 1908, and governor from 1908 to 1912, the U.S. Congressman from Louisiana's 6th District from 1917 to 1921, a fire-breathing Protestant who fought liquor and gambling. Sanders ran unsuccessfully for U.S. Senate in 1912, 1920, and 1926. While governor, Sanders accomplished little and succumbed to the conservative backroom politics of gentlemanly know-nothingness, but kept Louisiana mired in the 19th century. His refusal to improve the state's archaic highways earned him the nickname Gravel Road Sanders. Huey claimed he had opposed Sanders in every election since 1908, including the 1926 Senate race, when he campaigned across the state for incumbent Senator Ed Broussard, and against that long-legged sapsucker Sanders. Sanders was now bent over by age, prompting Huey to call him Old Buzzardback. J.Y. detested Huey, writing that when it comes to arousing prejudice and passion, when it comes to ranting and raving, when it comes to vituperation and vilification, when it comes to denunciation and demagoguery, there is one who stands out by himself. Huey has many imitators but no equals. Any meeting between the two men usually turned ugly. Ugly indeed was the scene on Tuesday, November 15, 1927, when Huey and Sanders clashed in the Hotel Roosevelt lobby. Huey had just arrived in New Orleans for a week of campaigning and headed to his headquarters on the hotel's 12th floors. Unexpectedly, he ran into J.Y., who was just leaving the dining room. When he spotted Huey, Sanders yelled across the marble column lobby that he was a damn liar. Huey jumped on the ex-governor, punched him, and then turned and ran to an elevator at the other end of the hotel. Sanders, portly and puffing and bent over with age, chased Huey to the elevator and squeezed in before the door shut. The two men wrestled on the floor as the boy opening up the elevator watched in stunned silence. Bystanders broke up the scuffle. Neither man was injured and both claimed victory. J.Y. declared that Huey crouched in the elevator like a terror-stricken kitten, and Huey's opponents branded him as a coward who fled from the 60-year-old ex-governor. Later that afternoon, Huey strutted through the lobby, victoriously chewing on a 6-inch cigar and flaunting a part of J.Y.'s shirt cuff ripped off in the elevator. That evening, he still waved J.Y.'s torn cuff and bragged of his elevator triumph as he spoke to a huge crowd in Palmer Park on Carrollton Avenue. Huey ended his campaign on Saturday night, January 14, 1928, with a packed rally at the Lafayette Theater in New Orleans. He estimated that he had delivered 600 speeches, traveled 15,000 miles, and addressed 300,000 people during the campaign. From New Orleans, he took the train north to await the election results at his family home in Shreveport. Tuesday morning, January 17th, dawned bright and clear with no hint of rain. As the election returns began to pour in later that evening, the first results from New Orleans revealed Huey did poorly in the Crescent City. The Wilson camp and the Old Regulars, boasted by a New Orleans item prediction of their victory, were confident that Huey would again finish a poor third and receive fewer votes than he did in 1924. Indeed, the New Orleans tally was Wilson, 38,244 votes. Simpson in second with 22,324 votes, and Huey a distant third with 17,819. The country vote began to come in late that night and into the next morning and showed a heavy turnout in rural parishes. The North County tally showed Huey with a large majority, but the Wilson supporters remained unshaken, as they had expected the northern parishes to support Huey just as they had in 1924. The votes from Acadiana, however, shocked Huey's opponents. Huey swept the French parishes as handily as he swept the North County. And with more than enough votes to pass Wilson, overall Huey carried 47 of the state's 64 parishes and 6 of the 8 congressional districts. In some French parishes, he racked up a surprising majorities of 60 to 70%. When the statewide votes were tallied, Huey polled 126,842 votes to Wilson's 81,747 and Simpson's 80,326. For the first time, a Protestant politician successfully invaded predominantly Catholic South Louisiana. Huey's support came not from the truly poor, as sometimes believed, but small independent farmers and merchants. The poll tax prohibited many of the state's poor from voting, and sharecroppers who were controlled by the planters were not yet a voting force. Huey performed weakly in the cities, failing to win his own hometown, Shreveport, and the state's capital of Baton Rouge. He was furious that Sullivan and Ewing delivered few New Orleans votes. Harvey Ellis, his former campaign manager who resigned over the long Ewing-Sullivan pact, wrote to Huey to rub it in. "What did I tell you?" Because no candidate received a majority of votes, the state's law required a second Democratic primary between the top two finishers, Huey and Riley Joe. The Choctaws and many other observers assumed that Simpson and his supporters now would back Wilson, giving Riley Joe more than enough votes to win. Huey, knowing he needed Simpson's votes, took the first train south from Shreveport with his wife, Rose. He arrived in New Orleans on Thursday morning and immediately began to bargain with Simpson's supporters. Simpson could not be located, but was rumored to be on a prolonged drunk. That's written kind of weird, but yeah, drowning his sorrow in booze, essentially. Wilson's campaign began to collapse on Saturday when the Times-Picayune, which backed Simpson, refused to endorse Wilson and became the first major paper to call Riley Joe to withdraw from the race. At the same time, Paul Mahoney, an ambitious new regular who ran Simpson's New Orleans campaign, sensed that the political winds had shifted in Huey's direction and abandoned Wilson. That year before, Huey backed Maloney's unsuccessful bid for New Orleans mayor, and now his support paid off. With these defections and other backroom deals, Simpson shifted his support to Huey. Simpson later accepted $5,000 per year state attorneyship from Huey and became secretary of Long's controlled state senate. On Sunday evening, Riley Joe met with his supporters in New Orleans and decided not to run in the second primary. He conceded later that night. With Wilson's surrender, Huey Long stood as the only remaining Democratic candidate, and facing no realistic Republican opposition in the one-party state, he was now the next governor of Louisiana. As word of Huey's victory spread across the city, hundreds of his supporters began filling the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel. As the night wore on, the crowd became noisier and drunker, slapping each other on the back and hollering in triumph. In their midst was Huey, with his tousled hair falling down upon his red face and bloodshot eyes, with his sweat-soaked shirt pulled open at the neck. He shouldered his way through the crowd, pumping the hands of his followers, and in his tired, hoarse voice kept repeating to each of them, "We'll show them who's boss. You fellows stick with me. We're just getting started." Huey Long sent a forceful message that he was going to be not only governor of Louisiana, but also its undisputed political boss. On February 16, 1928, 3 months before he took the oath as governor, state Democratic Party leaders met in New Orleans to plan a convention to select delegates for the presidential convention to be held the following summer in Houston. For years, the traditional method for selecting delegates had been by a statewide convention, but Huey decided otherwise. He discovered no requirement for a convention and learned that the party's central committee could select the delegates. 2 days after the state Democratic leaders met, Huey called a quorum of the party's committee that he stacked with his own supporters. He chaired the meeting and ordered his own slate of delegates approved, naming Colonel Ewing as national committeeman and himself as a delegate at large. Huey's committee selected no old regulars or any of his enemies as delegates. The old regulars and Delta planters were furious but powerless. Former governors J.Y. Sanders and Ruffin Pleasant, left off Long's slate, attacked Huey. Pleasant threatened to beat up the cowardly Huey and called him a red-mouthed, white-livered, yellow-backboned enemy of our country. Harry Gamble, who served as Parker's campaign manager during that governor's election, led the fight for the old Democrats. Gamble, an anti-Long attorney from Natchitoches, recently elected to the legislature, accused Huey of being another Mussolini. Soon after the inauguration, Huey removed Gamble from his position as state inheritance tax attorney and gave the job to his brother, Earl. So we're going to see one of Huey's successful methods that if anyone is trying to gain power, even today, especially at a state level, is, you have to, as Donald Trump promised to do, drain the swamp, which he didn't do, and he just put in more swamp creatures. And Huey literally did that. He started kicking out and getting out all the people he could that were against him and started getting his own people in there so he can actually get the things done that he promised to the people. Because in this kind of system, in the parliamentary system and the republic and the democracy, etc., you're never going to get anything done unless you got majority support. So Huey went about piece by piece making sure he got that. He got rid of his enemies, or he bribed his enemies by any means necessary to get what he promised done. Undeterred by Gamble's attacks, Huey fired back his statement from Shreveport on February 24th. that made no excuses for his tactics. "They say that we were steamrolled," he wrote. "The only reason that roller didn't pass over more of them was because there were no more in the way. I had promised my people that I would put this gang of bosses and plunder bun pie eaters out of control of the Democratic Party just as quick as I could. We hesitated very little about it." So that's great. They're like, oh, he's undemocratic. You can't do this. He's like, well, I told you, we're going to get you all out of there. Yeah, they steamrolled their enemies. He said he would, and that's exactly what they did. And I love, they say, oh, you're complaining. We would have steamrolled more if there was more in the way. Huey knew he must also strike fast to take control of the Louisiana legislature. A week before his inauguration, legislators arrived in Baton Rouge for their regular session. Huey was a step ahead and already hard at work when they arrived. He worked feverishly behind the scenes, pursuing party bosses and making deals to have his own supporters placed in committee leadership positions. Only 18 of 100 representatives and 9 of 39 senators had been elected as Long supporters. While a similar number opposed him, Huey concentrated on winning the remaining uncommitted members and promised them jobs, patronage, and other boodle. He showed a genius for persuasion and deal-making, and, according to a supporter, knew how to trade a cat for a cow, the cow for an elephant, and the elephant for a farm. For Speaker of the House, Huey chose a newly elected legislator, John Fumet. A bright, witty Cajun, Fumet flashed a ring with an extraordinary large diamond. Despite the legislator's lack of experience, the House members elected Fumet as Speaker, 72-27. For President pro tempore of the Senate, pro tempore means like for the time being, Huey chose another Frenchman, Philip Gilbert, a paunchy little aristocrat from Napoleonville, in Assumption Parish. Gilbert won easily, 27-10. As his floor leader in the Senate, Huey selected his boyhood friend, O.K. Allen, who had just been elected to the legislature. Soon after, Huey appointed Allen as a chairman of the Highway Commission and later picked his New Orleans benefactor, Robert Mastry, as head of the Department of Conservation. In the past, the legislature picked its own committee chairman and members, but Huey rewrote the rules. He called in Fournette and Gilbert and personally dictated the name of every member of every committee. Huey had them appoint Harley Boozman, a boyhood pal and new legislator, as chairman of the Import House Appropriations Committee. He ordered old regular legislators banished from the powerful committee chairmanships and assigned them to meaningless committees where they can do him no harm. Loyal Longites took their place. He particularly angered the New Orleans delegation when he selected only 2 old regulars to sit on the New Orleans City Affairs Committee, while stacking it with 13 trusted representatives from rural parishes. It was Tuesday, May 22, 1928, the morning after the inauguration and Huey's first day at work as Louisiana's new governor, and, like so many others to follow, a busy one. His first order of business was to kick the rascals out and to take firm control of the state government bureaucracy. He assaulted the state's powerful boards and commissions, dismantling agencies over which he had immediate authority, firing old appointees and selecting his own men for the jobs. With thousands of workers, the Highway Commission, the State Board of Health, the Hospital Board, and the Orleans Parish Levy Board were prime targets of Huey's political house cleaning. Before the day ended, he fired 73 New Orleans Dock Board employees and cashiered 80 out of the 100 Highway Commission speed cops, replacing them with his own men. Over the next few weeks, he removed from office every major and minor employee whose job he controlled. And by the time he finished, he commanded thousands of workers across the state and began amassing a powerful arsenal of spoils, patronage, and political support. Huey ruthlessly took over the state boards and commissions. He required new appointees to sign undated letters of resignation. If the appointee ran away, he merely filled in the date and accepted the resignation. I mean, that's freaking genius. That is genius. He also settled old political grudges. He detested the president of the Board of Health, Dr. Oscar Dowling, who had served under 5 previous governors. Dowling's term of office did not expire until 1932, but Huey was determined to remove him. He forced the legislature to pass a bill cutting Dowling's term short, and a week later fired Dowling and appointed his own replacement. Huey dealt similarly with the powerful New Orleans Levee Board to take control of the board, which maintained the dikes protecting the city from the Mississippi and had one of the largest employment roles in the state. He pressured the legislature to dissolve the old board and create a new 5-member body. 4 of the new appointees were Long supporters, and the vast Levee Board patronage fell into Huey's grasp. That summer, Huey grabbed control of the New Orleans Dock Board, another patronage stockpile, and fired another enemy in his son of a bitch book, Marcel Garçaud, general manager of the city's port authority. Huey's crude methods shocked his opponents. Used to passive governors who seldom interfered with legislative prerogatives, his foes quickly realized that he ignored or rewrote the rules to force the legislator to carry out his political agenda. "I'd rather violate every one of the damn conventions and see my bills passed," he admitted, "than sit back in my office all nice and proper and watch 'em die." His relentless energy also astounded his opponents. With no hesitation, he dashed unexpectedly out of his office and up the sweeping spiral staircase to the Capitol's second floor. He burst into the legislative chambers and brazenly accosted senators and representatives at their desks, ordering them to vote for his pet bills or against those of his opponents. Abandoning protocol and any separation of powers, he stomped through committee rooms and scattered committees with a nod of his head or the crooking of a finger. He entered the Senate and House, organized his own system of runners on the floor, and bullied the legislators with frowns, stinging jokes, and foul-mouthed threats. Many of the legislators loudly protested Huey's meddling, but he ignored them. After he barged unannounced into a committee hearing one night, one irritated senator threw a copy of the Louisiana Constitution at Huey's head. "Maybe you've heard of this book," shouted the senator. The governor picked it up, looked at the title, flipped it aside, and shot back, "I'm the Constitution now." Soon after the legislator arrived, Huey introduced several bills aimed to carry out his agenda and increase his control. Although he did not hold a majority of the legislators, he managed to get his legislation passed through a loose alliance of lawmakers from the rural North and from Acadiana. He soon became impatient with the legislator when a backlog of routine legislation delayed his bills from being brought to vote. To speed up the legislative process, he ordered his floor leaders to no longer fight his opponent's legislation, but instead move every bill through the committees, limit floor debate to a minimum, and allow all legislation to pass quickly as possible. To his delight, the legislator cleared the backlog in 4 hours. Later, when the huge pile of legislation reached the governor's desk for approval, Huey carefully sorted through each of the bills, signed his own legislation into law, and vetoed the objectionable bills by the score. Many of the bills he vetoed were pork barrel measures, such as the construction of a road or new schoolhouse in a particular legislator's district. In the past, a governor routinely signed these bills, as they were legislators' political lifeblood back in his home parish. Huey, however, signed only the bills proposed by his supporters and vetoed those of his shocked opponents. One of the bills that Huey proposed and signed was Act 99, creating the Bureau of Criminal Identification, the BCI. The BCI was independent of all sheriffs, police, constables, and possessed the unprecedented power to make arrests anywhere in the state of Louisiana without warrants for all violations of the law. Huey personally framed the act, which called for the governor to chair the BCI's board of managers and select its members. Secretive and powerful, the BCI provided Huey with a hefty political weapon and signaled as an ominous first step towards the creation of a police state, so creating his own special police. Huey asked the treasurer, H.B. Connor, for funds to build a new mansion on the present site. That's the governor's mansion he's talking about. But Connor told the governor he could provide the funds only after the legislature approved the expenditure. Huey ignored Connor's ruling and asked the State Board of Liquidation, the agency authorized to borrow money and incur debt, to grant a $150,000 loan to construct a new mansion. The board approved the loan, but, agreeing with Connor, said that Huey first needed the legislator's approval. The loan approval from the board was all that Huey felt that he needed. He phoned the warden of the state penitentiary at Angola and told him to send a gang of convicts to Baton Rouge. When the prisoners arrived, Huey led them from the Capitol to the mansion and cheered them as they demolished the old building. The Louisiana Railroad Commission regulated interstate railroads, pipelines, and public utilities, and was one of the most powerful bodies in the state. To Huey Long, the commission was a perfect place for him to run for his first public office and launch his political career. In 1918, 10 years before he became governor, 25-year-old Huey entered the race for a railroad commissioner representing the 28 parishes of North Louisiana. Before Huey became a member, the Railroad Commission had been a stagnant three-member body that was slave to the state's wealthiest interests. As soon as he took office, Huey rebelled against the wealthy businessmen who had controlled the commission's decisions and demanded that the freight rates be lowered to help the small farmers. After he became commission chairman in 1922, he injected new energy and independence into the agency, later renamed the Public Service Commission. During his 10-year tenure, he worked to increase the commission's and his own power. He crusaded for lower utility rates, forced the railroads to extend their services to small villages and hamlets, and demanded that the Standard Oil Company end the importation of Mexican crude oil and use more oil from Louisiana wells. Once he became governor, Huey turned against the commission. He stripped much of its authority in order to attack two of its members, who were his bitter political opponents. One of them, Francis Willis, a big red-haired New Orleans politician, had been elected to the commission in 1922. Francis was charismatic and eloquent speaker and, like Huey, hated the New Orleans Ring. Francis and his loosely knit New Orleans political organization, the Independent Regulars, backed Huey in his unsuccessful 1924 race for governor. However, Francis's independence garnered few New Orleans votes, and Huey never forgave him for the weak political support. Soon after taking office, Francis joined forces with Huey to outvote the third member and elect Huey chairman of the commission. For 2 years, the two men cooperated in fighting for lower utility rates across the state. Their friendship soured after 1924 when Huey refused to support Francis in the race for New Orleans mayor and instead backed another maverick politician card dealer, Paul Mahoney. Francis and Huey openly broke in December 1926 when a new public service commissioner, Dudley LeBlanc, took office, a feisty little Cajun with round spectacles. From the first day, Huey hated Dudley. During the Public Service Commission meeting at the end of 1926, Francis and Dudley joined together and voted Huey from his chairmanship, replacing him with Francis. From then on, Huey rarely attended commission meetings. Now governor in June 1928, Huey punished Dudley and Francis by vetoing all the commission's funding. He saw no contradiction in crushing the same agency in which he launched his own political career. He also admitted that he enjoyed retaliating against his enemies and firing people not decidedly on his side. No music ever sounded one half so refreshing, he admitted, as the whines and moans of pie eaters when shoved away from the pie. Other political opponents suffered Huey's wrath during the first months in office. One of them, District Judge H.C. Drew. He had been elected to the State Court of Appeal. Drew decided to resign his district judgeship 3 months early so that the post would be vacant for more than a year, thereby requiring an election to fill the vacancy. Huey wanted to appoint his own replacement and simply refused to accept Drew's resignation. Once the vacancy had less than a year left, Huey ordered the state Supreme Court, then stacked with loyal Long supporters, to select another Longite, Judge J.F. McInnes. Refusing a resignation has never been done before, but Huey used a simple administrative act to have his own man appointed. In little time, Huey used his political skullduggery to go through the list of government employees, replacing dozens of office holders of questionable loyalty with his own supporters. None of his enemies were too weak and no political job too unimportant to receive attention. That first winter, Huey forced Dr. V.L. Roy to resign as president of the State Normal School in Natchitoches. Roy, who had served as president of the college for 18 years, claimed Huey fired him for refusing to campaign for a judge running for the state Supreme Court and to support the referendum on constitutional amendments. On election day, the governor called me on the telephone, Roy explained, and told me that one of the ballot boxes near the State Normal School wasn't going right, to go out and get busy. I was incensed, and I never heard such a request being made of a college president. Nor was Huey adverse to nepotism. He appointed his brother Earl as inheritance tax collector, earning $15,000 a year. Within months of taking office, Huey placed at least 23 of his relatives on the state payroll, including Earl as tax collector, a sister on the faculty of the state college, 2 brother-in-laws, and good jobs in his new Bureau of Criminal Identification and Shreveport Charity Hospital, plus other state jobs for the uncle and 18 cousins. He appointed his cousin T.W. Tyson to replace Dr. Roy as college president in Natchitoches at a salary of $7,200 a year, close to the $7,500 Huey drew as governor. Huey liked to joke about giving jobs to his kin. Look at old Jess Nugent, a distant relative and vice chairman of the Highway Commission. Huey boasted to one of his staff, "He's the best employee in the whole state. He does his work better than anyone we got." Finally, someone asked what Jess did. "Not a goddamn thing," Huey snapped back. When the newspapers published the names of the relatives he hired, he laughed and confessed the list was incomplete, bragging that he would have placed more of his kinfolk on the payroll if some of them were not being housed and fed at the state penitentiary. Of all of Huey's campaign promises, none was more important than to provide free school books to the state's children and to stop the fleecing of the barefooted Louisiana schoolboy. Seymour Weiss, the manager of the Roosevelt Hotel, remembered when Huey penciled his proposal for free school books on the cardboard backing from one of his starched shirts. On Huey's first day of work as governor, Superintendent of Education T.H. Harris, whom Huey stayed with 18 years before as a high school debater, paid a call on the new governor. Like Huey, Harris wanted to improve the education in the state. The two men agreed to increase the funding for education, including providing free school books by raising the severance tax on oil taken from Louisiana wells. The new severance tax would raise $2 million and allow them to abolish the unpopular tobacco tax, which previously provided $1.5 million for education. On Friday, May 25, 1928, Representative J.E. McCallahan proposed the new severance tax before the legislature. A new member of the House from the Caldwell Parish, McCallahan served as the anti-Long sheriff of his parish only a few months before. Sensing Huey's growing power, McCallahan switched allegiance and would serve as his loyal floor leader until Huey appointed him warden of the state penitentiary. Legislators debated the severance bill into the summer, passing it in early July. A month later, Standard Oil filed a suit claiming the severance tax was unconstitutional, and as the schools opened in the fall, the lawsuit held up the money for free school books. Huey was furious. Until the court settled the Standard Oil suit, Huey could not use the new severance tax to fund the school books. He convened the Board of Liquidation and obtained an authorization for $500,000 to buy the books, with the loan to be repaid when the courts resolved the lawsuit. Huey took the authorization of the New Orleans bank to get the loan, but the bank declared that such a loan was illegal because there was no guarantee that the court would rule against Standard Oil. Unfazed, he reminded the bankers that the Board of Liquidation already owed their bank $935,000, which the legislator previously ordered paid. "It ain't gonna be paid," he threatened. "Your attorneys ruled those loans illegal, and if it's illegal to make them, it's illegal to pay them. We'll keep the $935,000 and buy the books and have $435,000 to spare." Huey stormed out of the bank, marched down the street to the Roosevelt Hotel, and ordered a sandwich in the restaurant. As he sat alone at his table and waited, a banker rushed in to tell him that he could have the loan immediately. "Take back the sandwich," he ordered, "and fry me a steak." In the summer of 1928, New Orleans civic leaders asked the new governor to crack down on gambling in the city and the surrounding parishes. Huey, who as a youth challenged his luck at the roulette table and dice dens, did not have a strong hostility towards gambling, but he recognized the opportunity to gain political support from some of the more stalwart New Orleans citizens. He issued a statement directing officials in St. Bernard and Jefferson to halt gambling in their parishes and warned the city to enforce its own laws. "We are not going to stand for open lawlessness in the New Orleans area during the 4 years I am governor." Huey's attack on gambling and his heavy-handed use of the National Guard outraged many citizens. When anti-Long Attorney General Percy St. learned of the raids, he declared the use of the National Guard illegal and marching into the teeth of the law. So he was using the National Guard to break up some of these gambling houses. Huey denounced the Attorney General's ruling. "Nobody asked him," he snapped back. "I warn the gamblers now, right in the city of New Orleans and elsewhere, that the Attorney General Saint's opinion will do them no more good than it did for the gamblers at Jai Ali and the Araby Club in St. Bernard Parish and Beverly Garden." At first, Huey's free school books angered the state's Catholics because a Louisiana law forbade the state funds from being spent on sectarian or private schools. They complained that they were being discriminated against because only the public schools received the free books. Not wanting to antagonize Catholic voters, Huey ordered the legislature to pass a bill that called for the books to go directly to the children, not to the schools. To him, providing the books to all children, regardless of religion, would be a secular act. The state superintendent of schools, T.H. Harris, opposed giving free books to Catholic school children and told Huey his bill was unconstitutional. "I'm a better lawyer than you are," Huey shot back at Harris, "and books for children attending private schools go into the act." The bill passed. In the northwest corner of the state, Huey faced another problem with his free school book plan. The more affluent people of his hometown of Shreveport in Caddo Parish never accepted him into their city's higher society, and most of his citizens fought his election as governor. Along with neighboring Bossier Parish, they fought the free school book plan and obtained a restraining order from Baton Rouge judge forbidding the distribution of textbooks in their two parishes. "This is a rich section of the state," Shreveport Mayor Wet Jug Thomas announced. "We're not going to be humiliated or disgraced by having it advertised that our children had to be given books for free." In December 1928, Huey struck back at Caddo and Bossier during the 6-day special session of the legislature. At the time, the U.S. Army was investigating possible locations for a new air base, and Shreveport was among the 50 communities around the country being considered. The air base would become the home of the 3rd Attack Wing, with 200 officers, 1,500 enlisted men, and over 200 aircraft, and would add $5 million to the Shreveport economy. In order to compete for the base, Shreveport needed the governor's approval to give 80 acres of state land to the Army for the airfield. A delegation from Shreveport, including Huey's friend W.K. Henderson and Robert Ewing's son, John, expected the governor's immediate approval, but they underestimated his capacity to hold a grudge. Huey refused to sign the authorization for the air base until Shreveport accepted the textbooks. Desperate for the base, the leaders of Caddo and Bossier surrendered to the governor and agreed to take the free school books. "I didn't coerce them," Huey boasted later. "I stomped them into distributing the books." The following spring, after several prolonged justices were elected to the Louisiana Supreme Court, the High Court justices denied the complaints of Caddo-Bossier parishes and voted 4-3 to uphold the free school book law. During the school year, Huey ordered over 600,000 new textbooks to be printed and distributed to Louisiana school children. With many families previously unable to afford to pay for books, the free textbook plan increased school attendance by 15,000 pupils. That fall, as children returned to school from summer vacation, Huey received a letter scribbled in pencil from a child in Forest Hill. "Dear Governor Long," the letter read, "I surely appreciate the free textbooks. You are the only governor of Louisiana who has done what you said you would. I am 13 years old. I am in the 8th grade. I expect to finish school. Sincerely yours, Helen Edwards." "I hope that natural gas can be brought to New Orleans peacefully," Huey Long warned the political leaders of New Orleans. "But if the gentlemen who are branded to keep it from coming here want a roughhouse, they want to remember that I can stand more roughhouse than they ever saw." For several years before Huey's election, the old regulars and city bankers had allowed the New Orleans Public Service Incorporated, the NOPSI, to be the only provider of gas, electricity, and streetcar service in the city. NOPSI had conspired with the businesses and political leaders to allow only expensive artificial gas to be brought into New Orleans, even though cheap, efficient natural gas was available across Louisiana. The arrangement was profitable to all parties, except the city's consumer. While politicians had promised to bring natural gas into the city in the past, none had seriously attempted to confront the NOPSI's monopoly. During the testimonial dinner given in February 1928, Huey repeated his campaign promise to bring natural gas to New Orleans, and once in office, did not hesitate. "It is plain to me that the New Orleans being fought from within," he told a newspaperman. "Those who have been elected to protect and serve the people have failed in their duties for the past many years. The old regulars fought his natural gas proposal. Semmes Walmsley, a Choctaw commissioner of finance and soon to be mayor, condemned Huey's proposal. It is impossible to hasten this development," Walmsley declared. "It must be taken in a sane, orderly, and scientific manner, and we certainly do not propose to use any half-baked methods." Huey's opponents underestimated the new governor's determination to get his way. He ordered his lieutenants to introduce a series of bills before the state senate, including a constitutional amendment authorizing the New Orleans city government to spend up to $50 million to purchase the NOPSI and bring natural gas to the city. Another bill permitted the city to operate the utilities. The old regular political bosses knew that if the bills were enacted, they would destroy their profitable monopoly. Huey did not favor a government takeover of utility, but his bills provided the threat that he needed. When the NOPSI and the old regulars refused to negotiate, he maneuvered his takeover bills quickly through the state senate committees and onto the floor, where they passed. He then delayed passage in the House while the public sentiment built against the NOPSI and waited for his opponents to act. Before long, the old regulars and the NOPSI realized they were beaten. Walmsley wired Huey that they were ready to negotiate. On July 7th, less than 2 months after he proposed his takeover bills, the New Orleans City Council passed a motion that adopted the rate prescribed by Huey, and the NOPSI agreed to bring natural gas to the city at a price lower than that of the artificial gas. 2 days later, Huey ordered the House Judiciary Committee to kill his bills taking over the utility. So political maneuvering, breaking the back of the rich, selfish elite that had been running New Orleans. I mean, look at what he has to go through just to get natural gas at a decent price for the citizens in New Orleans. And people criticize him as a dictator and the moves he's pulling. But, I mean, look at what their representatives were doing all the way up until Huey came there. He has to go through all of this threatening and forcing bills through and using political maneuvers just to simply get natural gas or free school books to kids. He has to go through all of this. And as we'll go on, you'll see with paving the roads of Louisiana as well, many other things. So he is like a Caesar coming in and putting the corrupt Senate under heel, exposing the sham of democracy and representative republics and the capitalist mindset. Since 1909, the Standard Oil Company's refinery, the world's largest, had dominated Baton Rouge, stretching several miles along the east bank of the Mississippi River. The refinery sprouted a forest of smokestacks, sheet metal sheds, and a plantation of massive red tanks brimming with petroleum from the Gulf oil fields. When the wind blew from the northwest, the mothers of Baton Rouge ordered their children inside to escape the stench and oily grit that drifted down upon the city. Ever since 1918, when he took his first public office as State Railroad Commissioner, Huey had attacked Standard Oil relentlessly. He had personal reasons for hating the giant oil company. As a young attorney, he invested $1,050 into a local dependent oil drilling business that subsequently struck oil. His stock soared at first, but Standard Oil later refused to accept any oil from independent producers, and many of them were put out of business. To Huey, this oil giant represented all that was evil in American business. A huge monolithic corporation run by millionaires that used its vast financial resources to crush the little man. As Public Service Commissioner, he failed in his attempt to have Standard Oil declared a public utility, thereby placing the price of its oil under state regulation. He had also tried to force the company to stop importing Mexican crude oil and instead refine more Louisiana oil. And here's where you get to split from people like a Stephen Molyneux and other money grubbers and capitalist charlatans who masquerade as nationalist, but at the same time have no problem with someone like a Standard Oil importing Mexican crude oil because it's cheaper for them. And it doesn't matter if they crush out the little man. During the first campaign for governor, Huey denounced the invisible empire of Standard Oil Company, a reference linking the giant oil company to the Ku Klux Klan. That is the invisible empire, what they used to call the KKK. This octopus is among the world's greatest criminals, he now roared as governor. It was thrown out of Texas following its raid on Spindletop. It was ousted from Kansas. It was forced to terms in Oklahoma. In another tirade, he charged that the state's farmers produced $180 million in crops a year, while Standard Oil's Baton Rouge refinery, pumping up to 100,000 barrels of oil each day, earned $216 million a year in profits. Even so, he added, the state's farmers paid 40 times more in taxes than Standard Oil. Huey needed money to pay for his new roads, expansion of the state hospitals, and other campaign promises. His ambitious programs had quickly exhausted the state treasury. Originally, he planned to fund the free school books with the increase in oil severance tax, but an unexpected ruling by the Supreme Court rescinded the increase. He was able to provide the free school books by forcing the banks to provide a loan, but he still needed new sources of revenue. To him, the obvious target was the rich vault of the Standard Oil Company. On Monday, March 18, 1929, Huey called a 6-day special session of the legislature to give him the authority to raise more funds. Although special sessions irritated some legislators who lost time from working at their home professions, he never hesitated in calling them to Baton Rouge. 3 months before December 1928, he convened a 6-day special session and succeeded in convincing the legislature to authorize bonds for his $30 million road building program. That session went well, as Huey worked the floor leaders to persuade each house to suspend its rules by a 2/3 vote and allow bills to be quickly introduced, read once, and passed with little debate. He personally orchestrated every step of the legislative process. When the vote was taken, he discovered that 2 members who promised to support him had disappeared. Needing their votes to get to 2/3 majority, a furious Huey learned where the men were hiding and ordered them brought to the floor by the state policeman. Huey was still confident he can control the legislature during another special session and get it to approve his ambitious plans for the new revenue. The session started off on a sour note when Rabbi Walter Pizer of Baton Rouge refused to offer an opening prayer. Feeling coerced and cheapened by Huey's actions, the rabbi said he could not in good conscience call down the blessings of God on such a governor who is unworthy of the high office he holds. The legislators were also edgy. Huey had given them only 2 days' notice before they had to report to Baton Rouge, the shortest notice ever given for special sessions in the state. When the legislators arrived, they expected to conduct only routine business during the session. They soon were surprised to learn that Huey's purpose for calling the special session was much more controversial, and that he proposed a radically new processing tax on refined oil. Unlike the severance tax that imposed a levy on crude oil extracted at the wellhead, an oil processing tax would impose a 5-cent per barrel levy on finished petroleum. He calculated that the new tax would yield $5,000 per day for the schools and nearly $2 million per year. The oil companies estimated the tax would cost them over $3 million. Huey had lit the fuse of a political bombshell. Every legislator from oil-producing parishes knew that voting for a processing tax meant suicide in their next election. Small increases in the severance tax, while fought by Standard Oil and other oil companies, had been more acceptable because the increases applied to a tax already on the books. An oil processing tax was a new source of revenue and a substantial burden on the oil industry. Other businessmen feared that Huey might expand occupational taxes in the future to include all types of business, not just oil. So as he's finding ways to squeeze their pockets to put it back into the community, all the fat cats are starting to squirm. The legislature, confused and surprised by Huey's new tax proposal, adjourned until the next morning. Overnight, his enemies began rallying for an attack. Standard Oil president Daniel Weller hurried from the company home office in New York and established headquarters in Baton Rouge's Heidelberg Hotel. He would stay in the town throughout the special session, pressuring legislators to join the fight against Huey's oil tax. Huey claimed that Weller and Standard Oil brought enough bribe money to burn a wet mule, and indeed Weller's cash began to convince several balky legislators to turn against Huey. "You could pick up $15,000 or $20,000 any evening," one representative admitted. Weller also knew that Standard Oil had the support of the citizens of Baton Rouge. He warned that Huey's new oil tax could cause Standard to shut down the refinery. Its loss would devastate the local economy of a city where, out of the population of 30,000, the refinery employed 8,000 workers. So dominant was the oil company that on refinery paydays, shops and banks along the city's bustling 3rd Street stayed open late into the night. On March 19th, the Baton Rouge Advocate, owned by the powerful Manship family, and usually neutral in political affairs, began to oppose Huey in editorial after editorial. In the front page article, the paper charged that all the years of planning and building and hoping on the part of a far-sighted citizenry have suddenly been jeopardized by the personal whim of a governor thrown by chance into a position where he can exercise that whim to the detriment of an industry he conceives to be antagonistic to him. The paper warned that Huey's spite tax would force Standard Oil to fire 2,000 local workers. The Advocate concluded that every daily newspaper, every chamber of commerce, every business executive, every man who has a payroll, every clear-thinking worker who values his Saturday pay envelope, and every public servant who can see further than his own end of Governor Long's big stick, opposed Huey's new oil tax. The first sign of serious trouble for Huey appeared when he failed to get the 2/3 of each house to suspend the rules. He understood the legislative process better than most representatives and realized he no longer could move his oil processing tax quickly through the legislature. He needed a longer session to gather more votes. On March 20th, Huey called for 18 days to be tacked onto the current 6-day session. He realized that the 6-day session was a big mistake, as did his foes. As Huey struggled to capture more votes, his bullying quickly upset many representatives, including several supporters. Rarely content to stay in his office to await the results of a vote, the impatient Huey charged through the Capitol corridors, up the sweeping stairway into the House or Senate, where he paced up and down inside the bar and in violation of the legislative rules. He barged into the legislative committees, interrupting the proceedings to campaign for his bill. Shortly after the session opened, Representative Lavinius Williams, an anti-Long legislator from New Orleans, spotted Huey pacing the legislative aisles and prodding House members. As Huey glared at him from the aisle, Williams called for an enforcement of House Rule 20 prohibiting visitors on the floor. "The House has stood for this indignity long enough," Williams declared. After Williams' motions passed, with loud applause, the sergeant of arms escorted the governor, his face burning red, from the floor of the House. Bombarded by his enemies and hostile newspapers, Huey lost his temper. On the morning of March 20th, he threatened Baton Rouge newspaper publisher Charles Manship that if the city's newspaper did not lay off me, I'm going to publish a list of the names of people who have relatives in the insane asylum. Huey knew that Manship's brother was confined in a state mental hospital. That afternoon, the front page of the Baton Rouge State Times revealed Huey's threat. "This, gentlemen, is the way your governor fights," read the bold-faced headline. "I might say, however," Manship wrote in an editorial, "that my brother Douglas is about the same age as the governor. He was in France in 1918 wearing the uniform of the United States soldier while Governor Long was campaigning for office." Huey used almost every ruse he could devise to force representatives to support his legislation. One of his targets was Cecil Morgan, a bright young attorney recently elected to the House from the Caddo Parish. Huey and Cecil knew each other well. In 1921, 2 years after Morgan graduated from LSU Law School, Huey asked him to become his law partner. Morgan, a Shreveport attorney struggling for business, declined because he disliked Huey's methods. "I couldn't do it," Morgan admitted later. "I didn't think he was ethical. During Morgan's first legislative session in 1928, Huey warned the young legislator that if he voted against his bills, including the highway bond issue, he would fire his father, an elderly state bank examiner. Morgan ignored Huey's threat and defiantly voted against the bills. Huey fired his father, despite the bank's examiner's guaranteed overlapping 6-year terms. I moved my family to Shreveport, bought them a small house, Morgan recalled. I was unmarried then, and I had to borrow money to do it. He hit me on my tenderest spot when he fired my father. Huey was as cold-blooded in his desire for power as any human being could be. Huey angered many legislators when he announced in the radio speech that any legislator who voted against the oil processing tax had been bought. On the House floor, Gilbert Dupree, an elderly and deaf representative from the St. Landry parish, who had served in the legislature since 1888, rose to defend his colleagues. Despite his age, the crusty Dupree soon would become one of Huey's most zealous antagonists. This house is not a den of thieves, argued the old proud Creole. There may be a lot of damn fools, and there may be some damn rascals, but the majority are intent upon doing their duty. On Friday morning, March 22nd, the Shreveport Journal called for a thorough investigation of Governor Long's behavior and, if necessary, swift and determined action to oust him should be taken, and he should be immediately impeached from office. The next day, Senator Charles Hudson of DeSoto Parish sent Sear a telegram urging the lieutenant governor to begin impeachment proceedings. Later in the week, Manship's advocate declared that Governor Long's tyranny over Louisiana should end, and called for the impeachment to proceed calmly and deliberately. Within a week, 3 large New Orleans newspapers, the Times-Picayune, Item, and States, joined the call for Huey's ouster. His opponents, including Cecil Morgan and several young legislators, closed ranks and enlisted other representatives who previously had been fence-sitters. Late at night, lights burned in the office windows throughout Baton Rouge as politicians plotted their strategy either to defend Huey or to send him packing. Huey, barricaded in his suite on top of the floor of the Heidelberg Hotel, sensed disaster. From his 12th floor window, he could look upon the Mississippi River. The water is rising, he reflected. It looks as if another flood might come. But it was not the mighty Mississippi that Huey was worried about. His governorship was at stake. Only a handful of his supporters remained loyal. My ground has begun to slip from under me, he wrote later. Rats began to leave the apparent sinking ship. I had to draw back to find out where I stood. On Sunday night, realizing that continuing the special session could lead to political disaster, Huey called Speaker Fournette and his other House leaders to his room at the Heidelberg. With no chance of passing the oil processing tax, he instructed his floor leaders to move for indefinite adjournment when the House convened the following evening. A legislator that was not in session, Huey knew, could not impeach a governor. On Monday evening, March 25th, hundreds of Baton Rougians finished supper early and strolled to the antebellum state capitol, perched off the bluff overlooking the Mississippi. They sensed something was going to happen, and they were going to be there to see it. Those who arrived early quickly grabbed one of the few seats in the spectator galleries of the House. The rest of the crowd milled around the Capitol grounds, waiting nervously for the session to begin. An electric tenseness filled the air when Speaker Fournette called the House to order just after sunset. As soon as the clerk completed the roll call, Representative Cleveland Furge, a long supporter from Evangeline Parish, rose to speak. During the meeting the night before, Huey ordered Furge to make the motion to adjourn sine die, which means without any further date being designated for resumption. Before Speaker Fournette could recognize Furge, however, Cecil Morgan jumped from his seat to take the floor. Fournette ordered Morgan to be seated, but the young legislator, quivering with excitement, refused. He declared loudly that one of the governor's former bodyguards had accused Huey of hiring him to assassinate Representative J.Y. Sanders. Jr., like Morgan Sanders, was a fiercely anti-Long legislator and the son of the former governor whom Huey had grappled with in the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel a year before. Speaker Fournette, pounding his gavel on the desk, ignored Morgan and recognized Furge, who shouted his motion to adjourn over angry cries from the House members and spectators seated in the gallery. Morgan stood trembling at his desk, waving an affidavit containing the bodyguard's accusation and demanding that a committee investigate the murder charge against Huey. "Put Mr. Morgan in his seat," Fournette ordered. While Morgan still yelled his accusations, dozens of House members jumped to their feet and began arguing loudly with one another. When the Sergeant of Arms, Major Stewart, moved towards Morgan, 12 anti-Long members, including Representative Mason Spence and George Perrault, who each weighed over 250 pounds, stood in a circle around Morgan with locked arms so that the Sergeant of Arms could not reach him. "That is a dastardly outrage," Morgan yelled. "You shall not vote me down until I've had my say." Still banging his gavel loudly, Fournette tried to end the ruckus and called for a vote on Ferg's motion to adjourn. House members rushed back to their seats and pressed the buttons on the electronic voting machine. The colored lights above the speaker's chair flashed, and the machine tallied 67 green lights in favor of adjournment and 13 red lights against. Fournette announced that the motion to adjourn passed, dropped his gavel on his desk, and hurried from the chamber. Many members who voted against the adjournment looked up and saw that the votes were incorrectly tallied as green votes. A howl of protest arose that made the State House walls tremble. "You goddamn crook," someone screamed. "Oh God, don't let him get away with this," another shout. The protesters were all on their feet, in the aisle, on the desk, clamoring towards the speaker's chair and shouting angrily that the vote was fixed. While Huey supporters surrounded the speaker's platform and defended it, fights broke out all over the chamber. Members wrestled on the floor. Inkstands, huge law books, and other debris flew through the air like missiles. Clinton Sayes, a hot-tempered anti-Long representative, climbed across the tops of the desk and tried to capture the speaker's platform. A group of Long supporters, including floor leader Loris Wimberly and former Tulane football player Lester Lautenschlager, cut off Sayes. The bald-headed wild fellow Sayes wanted to do physical harm to somebody and ran across desks, Lautenschlager remembered. It looked as if he had a pistol. "I ended up between him and the platform by Fournette and grabbed Sayes. He would not be calmed down." As Lautenschlager and others pounced upon Sayes, another anti-Long, Harney Bogan, leapt from top of the desk into a pile of wrestling representatives to rescue Sayes. He pulled Sayes out with blood pouring from his bald head. Depending on the source, Sayes received his wound either from a Long supporter wearing brass knuckles, a blow from a heavy cane, a diamond jutting from a ring on Wimberly's finger, or the blade of the ceiling fan that struck Sayes on the head when he climbed on top of the desk. Nevertheless, enough blood had spilled for the infamous night session to be dubbed Bloody Monday. So a full-out brawl in the local House meeting. Finally, Spencer, the huge hulking anti-Long legislator from Madison Parish, climbed atop the press table and bellowed a call for order. Hearing Spencer's booming voice, most of the brawlers paused for a moment. "Let us be sane," Spencer roared. "Let there be silence and let the House be polled by oral roll call." To Spencer's surprise, the House fell silent. Seizing the opportunity, he pulled each member by name, and a great roar erupted when he announced there were 79 votes to remain in session and only 9 votes to adjourn. Even with order somewhat restored, the House realized that it could not conduct any level-headed business that night and adjourned until the next morning. So a complete flip around in votes when they did it orally. As you can see, and throughout most of his story, it's Huey against the world. And he's doing what he can, to keep his head above water here. But, I mean, to put in context, everything he passed was for the betterment of Louisiana, the state, and especially the rural people, the poor people, the people that really never had a representative before him. Huey, looking as if a threshing machine had passed over him, left his office in the Capitol and headed to his suite on top of the Heidelberg Hotel. He was forlorn and distraught, for instead of facing a legislator that he firmly controlled only 3 months before, he now confronted what he described as a few hundred highly intelligent animals temporarily bereft of reason and milling wildly about. He miscalculated his power and failed to send the unmanageable legislators home. So he calls this fast session, this quick session, because he wants to get through this tax, this another tax on Standard Oil. And he thinks if he does it in the fast manner, he can shove it through and get it done as he's done before, as he did in a special legislate a year before, close to a year before. So when that backfires, and because of Standard Oil money, they sent in the bigwigs from New York, started throwing the money around, the pressure around, and the newspapers got behind Standard Oil and attacking Huey and just turning everyone against Huey and pressuring the other people of the legislature against Huey. When he realized that, and then now they're even going to try to impeach his governorship. So he tries to put the House off and say, let's do this at another time, take more time for this. And so at least he can get the impeachment off the tables and he can regroup and re-strategize and come back and try the Standard Oil tax again. But this time, the legislator's not having it. They're not going to adjourn it, and they also want to try to impeach him now. So everything's backfiring against him right now. They got him up against the wall. As you see, out of when they did the oral vote, only 9 people voted to end the session. He originally counted over 50 votes for adjournment, more than enough for passage, but once Cecil Morgan rose to announce the bodyguard's accusation, he lost control. Ominously, he was losing supporters fast. The legislator departed the Capitol that Monday night. Several who previously supported Huey announced that they were shifting allegiance. One of them, elderly Representative R. Miles Pratt, until that time a staunch supporter of the governor, declared he was against Long from now until hell freezes over. On Tuesday morning, March 26, an eerie, uneasy calm hung over the Capitol. As legislators walked across the grounds and through the large crowd milling about the State House, many waistcoats bulged from loaded revolvers stuck in men's belts. "I'll bet there were 500 pistols in that crowd," one senator remembered. Speaker Fournette opened the session with an apology to the House members for anything he may have done the night before to cause the fracas. He explained that the voting machine, an archaic and unreliable contraption powered by wet cell batteries, had malfunctioned and still showed the tally from a previous vote. Most representatives accepted the explanation, and those who didn't were not worried about punishing Fournette. They instead had turned their wrath to only one person, Huey Long. Throughout the night before, Huey's more militant opponents gathered to draw up a formal bill of impeachment. The Dynamite Squad, so named because it aimed to explode Huey's legislation, included Cecil Morgan, Mason Spencer, J.Y. Spencer Jr., George Perrault, and about a dozen other newly elected representatives. All were from the old aristocratic families and friendly with the old regulars. So once again, the familiar story of the mercantile aristocrats not liking what a man of the people is bringing to them. Once again, we go back to Julius Caesar in the Senate. "Those boys were not amateurs," remembered a Long loyalist. "Very skilled and smart." Now, after Bloody Monday, the dynamiters no longer were content to destroy Huey's legislation, but saw his impeachment as their only goal. They were nervous. "During the impeachment, our group was very cautious," Cecil Morgan remembered. "We always ate together and never went out alone at night." Throughout Monday night into Tuesday morning, the squad met in J.Y. Sanders' office on the 3rd floor of the Romaine building, devising their strategy and outlining the bill of impeachment. After drafting 19 charges of misconduct, the dynamiters walked a few blocks to the Capitol, bleary-eyed and wearied from no sleep, and just in time for the House to reconvene. As each member took the seat, he found sitting on his desk a petition listing 19 impeachment charges. Although most legislators knew what was coming, many of them were still awestruck when they heard one of the dynamic squad read solemnly, "Whereas Huey P. Long, governor of the state of Louisiana, has been guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors in office, incompetency, corruption, favoritism, oppression in office, gross misconduct." The 19 charges that followed were a patchwork of complaints, ranging from frivolous and absurd to serious and felonious. The bodyguard's accusation that Huey planned to murder J.Y. Sanders Jr. was, of course, the most serious of the impeachment charges. However, even Dynamite Squad members admitted there was little likelihood of the bodyguard's charges being true. Huey had fired that bodyguard, a slow-moving and dull-witted former prizefighter named Battling Bozeman, before the affidavit was signed. And vengeance was Bozeman's likely motive. The affidavit was a wild, rambling testimony, so full of inconsistencies that the dynamiters had no intention of entering it into the House proceedings. "No, I didn't believe battling Bozeman's story," Mason Spencer admitted later. But what a wonderful witness he made. Spencer and most other legislators believed that while Huey was a tyrant, he was incapable of murder. Later, the House dropped the murder charge, as well as frivolous complaints that accused Huey of carrying a concealed weapon, violently abusing citizens visiting him on public business, gross misconduct in public places, repeatedly appearing on the floor of the House of Representatives, purchasing a $20,000 ice machine for Angola Penitentiary without advertising for bids, fondling a New Orleans nightclub stripper, and uttering blasphemous and sacrilegious expression by comparing himself to the Savior. Other charges, much more serious, provided the grounds for impeachment and, if he was convicted by the Senate, Huey's removal from office. The more serious accusations allege that Huey illegally influenced the judiciary, offered bribes to the legislators, used the militia unlawfully to pillage private property, and improperly spent state money. Huey's opponents later tacked on a 20th catch-call charge that accused the governor of incompetency, corruption, and gross misconduct. With the charges now pressed, the anti-Long forces were overjoyed. An air of celebration spread over Baton Rouge, for most of the city capital steadfastly detested Huey and his cohorts. It was so bad during the impeachment that we fellows couldn't even get a shave and a haircut in Baton Rouge, one pro-Long legislator recalled. That's how bitter they were. The state's large daily newspapers, all of which were now rapidly anti-Long, had a field day. The Times-Picayune exhorted impeachment, saying Huey was temporarily and otherwise unfit to hold office and a cruel political tyrant, while the huge headline of Colonel Ewing states declared that the crooked game of Long is blocked. And Colonel Ewing, one of the only newspapers that supported him for governor, they had a blowout too with each other. So of course now his newspapers are going against Huey. Invoking the memory of the lost cause, the states applauded the legislators who fought against Huey on the floor, sons of men through whose veins coursed the good red blood of their fathers, who back in the dark days that tried men's souls when alien tyrants were despotically striving to enslave them, rose in their might and rid themselves of such tyranny. Forecasting the governor's demise, the states declared that Huey, like Aesop's fox, is now gnawing at his own tail to release himself. That Tuesday afternoon, placards sprouted about the city announcing a mass meeting to protest Huey's radical legislation and his attack on the prosperity and credit of the state. At 8 that night, the anti-Long forces gathered at the city's community club pavilion for a huge rally. 6,000 attended the impromptu carnival, where fireworks exploded, pistol shots rang into the night, and the 60-piece Standard Oil Band, poorly disguised in street clothes, entered the throng with lively melodies. From New Orleans came a trainload of the old regulars, eager to see the downfall of their hated governor. From the stage, a host of anti-Long speakers beat their breast and vented fire-breathing attacks on Huey, declaring him too weak and unlearned to be governor and calling him a dictator with scheming designs for purpose of satisfying a personal grudge and getting revenge. On a balcony across the street from the rally, a somber Huey stood in a darkened doorway where he could not be seen and listened intently to the speakers. On March 27, 1929, just 2 days after Bloody Monday, Huey began attacking his impeachers with a massive circular campaign, a tactic he used successfully during his campaign for governor to publicize his platform. Over the next few weeks, he dictated each circular to Alice Lee Grosjean and sent it to the Franklin Press in New Orleans for printing. Huey ordered his circulars sent out immediately across the state. The mail was too slow for him. As soon as the printers bundled the circulars, they rushed them to state workers driving highway commission trucks and state policemen on motorcycles, who then raced across the state, flooding the countryside with thousands of copies of his latest message. The circular campaign alone, totaling 900,000 copies, cost $40,000 to Bob Mastrey. To Huey, the greatest friend in foul weather, financed much of his counterattack. Huey's circulars assailed Standard Oil. "This is the fight of my life," he wrote in the first one, titled "The Cross of the Gold Standard Oil Company vs. Huey P. Long." They are laying their lines to try and ruin me, but we will have the entire state plastered with this literature before we are through. I have never rested since I became governor. I will not now." In a later circular, he swore, "I would rather go down 1,000 impeachments than to admit that I am a governor of a state that does not dare to call out the Standard Oil Company to account so that we can educate our children and care for the destitute, sick, and afflicted. If this state is still to be ruled by the power of the money of this corporation, I am too weak for its governor." And yet another, he asked, "Has it become a crime for the governor to fight for the school children and the cause of suffering and destitute humanity?" Still trying to build popular support, Huey called his own mass meeting at the community club on the night of April 3rd. "Watch out for the lying newspapers," he warned his followers in a circular. "They may announce that this meeting will be called off, or they may say that the governor has resigned. Pay no attention to anything they say. Come to Baton Rouge, don't take time to dress up." To build the crowd, he ordered hundreds of highway workers and other state employees from across the state to attend the rally. Owing their jobs to Huey, they quickly headed to Baton Rouge. Huey sent dozens of telegrams to his local political bosses drumming up support. The mayor of Pineville, Rollo Lawrence, received one of Huey's 3-page messages ordering him, "Bring the boys to Baton Rouge." Lawrence sent 5 cars filled with supporters to the state capitol. See, rallying the troops, this is how a true populist goes at it. You rally the people. By sunset, the city was swamped. Huey recalled, "Even the streets could hardly hold the crowds. It was a panic. Very few of the laborers or farmers had taken time to change from their working clothes to come to the Capitol." His opponents held a parade that ended in front of the Heidelberg Hotel, and his supporters held another that ended just up the street. Several fights erupted, and according to Lawrence, the clashes could have been a riot. Huey took the rostrum and spoke for 2 hours. With impassioned oratory, he accused Standard Oil of plotting his overthrow and appealed to the people to come to his defense. "The buzzards have returned," Huey roared. "They want to gloat and gulp at the expense of the poor and the afflicted." Near midnight, he ended his speech with his favorite quotation from Invictus, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." His supporters said it was his finest performance. "I saw people in front of the old Capitol on their knees praying for Huey during impeachment. Country people," a follower remembered. Each evening, Huey caucused with his defense team in the nearby Louisiana National Bank building, where they took over an entire floor. He was tireless as he prepared for the impeachment proceedings, sleeping only in snatches and seemed to subsist primarily on strawberries and cream. Early in the week, Earl Long called a local Baton Rouge businessman, L.P. Bahan, and ordered 34 typewriters brought to the Capitol. Soon a secretary was busy at each typewriter as Huey walked along the line dictating telegrams to each girl off the top of his head. Bahan did not charge Huey and afterward got all of the state's typewriter business. To fund his defense and to buy votes to stop his impeachment, Huey turned to Robert Mastry, a New Orleans millionaire who delivered $130,000 from unknown sources and with no strings attached. Standard Oil and Huey's other opponents also brought huge sums of cash to Baton Rouge for bribes. They offered a huge sum to buy Jules Fisher, a pro-Long senator from the Jefferson Parish shrimping family, and William Boone, a senator from Claiborne Parish, claimed he turned down $50,000 to impeach Huey. Both sides used other ruses besides money to coerce legislators. The president pro tem of the Senate, Philip Gilbert, opposed Huey at first, but a last-minute plan to build a road from Sicily Island to Winsboro in Gilbert's district was the reported payoff. The Long forces enticed Senator James Anderson, a Baptist minister, to a Baton Rouge hotel room for a compromising encounter with liquor and a prostitute. Facing political blackmail, Preacher Anderson joined Huey. By hook or by crook. God damn, don't you wish we had a fighter for the people like this today. Huey's opponents were no less nasty. Anti-Long forces, led by New Orleans attorney Esmond Phelps, threatened Representative Lester Lautenschlager that if he did not support impeachment, he would lose his job as backfield coach of the Tulane football team. The coach received a telegram dismissing him after he announced he would remain neutral until he heard all of the evidence. Tulane officials rehired Lautenschlager only after the other coaches threatened to resign. Henry Larcade, a pro-Long senator from Opelousas, felt the pressure in his hometown. During the impeachment session, anti-Longs tacked up notices in all businesses around Opelousas that read, "If Henry Larcade votes to acquit, he will be tarred and feathered if he returns to Opelousas." When Larcade returned home from Baton Rouge, he carried 2 pistols. His wife made him promise to get out of politics, and he burned all his papers. "Until impeachment, I never knew how low humanity could sink," one observer recalled. On April 26, the House impeachment hearings ended. Of the original charges, 7 were passed by the House and would be sent to the Senate for trial. The legislators charged Huey with attempting to blackmail Charles Manship, attempting to bribe legislators, and as if they weren't, not accounting for state money he had spent, specifically on the new automobile, illegally removing an official from the state training school, using mansion funds for personal purposes, using state money to purchase private law library, and permitting the construction company to build defective culverts. On the final day of the proceedings, the House voted on an 8th catch-call charge accusing Huey of forcing appointees to sign undated resignations, insulting citizens, discharging a college president, appointing a corrupt parole officer, and demonstrating that he was incompetent and temperamentally unfit for his office. Speaker Fournette argued the purpose of this bill is that if you can't catch him with one charge, you think you can catch him with another. Before Fournette could finish, one of the dynamite squad, Representative Harney Bogan, rushed into the chamber with blood pouring from his mouth and a gash in his cheek. Bogan had been in the Capitol lobby talking with Robert Mastrey when Huey's brother, Earl Long, approached. "Why are you talking to that son of a bitch?" Earl asked Mastrey. Bogan slugged Earl, and the 2 men clinched and grappled on the floor, where Earl sank his teeth into Bogan's cheek and bit him on the ear. Bystanders pried them apart. "I just tore Harney to pieces," Earl bragged later. Huey was in his hotel room when he learned of the fight. "I bet Earl bit him, didn't he? Earl always bites." The Senate was where the real trial would take place, and only the Senate, by 2/3 vote, had the power to remove a governor from office. Now that the House had completed its deliberations and forwarded the charges, all eyes turned to the deliberations that would begin across the hall in the Senate chamber. On May 14th, the Senate convened to try the impeachment charges. Presiding over the trial was Chief Justice Charles O'Neill, who swore Huey in as governor almost exactly a year before. Huey and O'Neill had been bitter enemies since they fought over the Dreyer-LaBeouf murder case. Huey referred to the Chief Justice, who walked with a limp, as a crooked-legged son of a bitch. When Long supporters protested that O'Neill was prejudiced against Huey and suggested he recuse himself, the feisty O'Neill fired back, "Don't they think that I'll give a thieving son of a bitch a fair trial?" On the first day of the Senate trial, Huey strutted into the chamber wearing his immaculate white suit, smoking another huge cigar, and took his seat at the table on the front row amid his battery of attorneys. The Senate was packed. At the rear of the chamber, carpenters built wooden bleachers to accommodate over 100 spectators, and tickets were issued for each seat. Huey's attorney argued that the impeachment was illegal. They based their defense on the fact that any charge filed after April 6th, the date set for adjournment of a special session, was invalid. After that date, according to his attorney, Leander Perez, the legislature would stop being a lawmaking body and become just a crowd of men. Because the Senate needed to examine and debate a number of complex charges, spectators expected the trial to be a long, dragged-out affair. 2 days after the Senate convened, at 10 o'clock Thursday morning, Philip Gilbert, President pro tempore of the Senate, rose from his seat, walked up the aisle, and, in his clipped French accent, began addressing his colleagues. The rotund little Cajun announced that he had a petition signed by a group of fellow senators who agreed that the charges against Huey should be dropped. In the petition, the senators declared that any charge filed after April 6 was invalid. The signers swore that they would not vote for Huey's impeachment, no matter what testimony followed and no matter what evidence was presented. 15 out of 39 senators, one more than needed to kill the two-thirds vote for conviction, signed the document. Huey had shocked his opponents again with his political skill. He had known that his only chance of survival was in the Senate, and he knew exactly how many votes he needed and which senators he could coerce to support him. While the House proceedings dominated the headlines, Huey used promises, threats, bribes, liquor, women, and any other stimulant he could devise to secure the votes of the 15 senators. And with their signatures now in hand, he had survived his closest call with political extinction. Gilbert's petition, thence emblazoned in Louisiana history as the notorious round robin, stunned the Senate, paralyzed Huey's opponents, and elated his supporters. Quietly, the senators realized there was nothing more they can do, adjourned sine die, and abruptly ended the impeachment proceedings.
I was elected Railroad Commissioner of Louisiana in 1918, and they tried to impeach me in 1920. When they failed to impeach me in 1920, they indicted me in 1921. And when I wiggled through that, I managed to become governor in 1928. And they impeached me in 1929.
After barely escaping impeachment, Huey immediately began punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends. He ordered his local political bosses to begin recall movements against 9 legislators who opposed him. The impeachment charges still stood in the House, and his enemies could again try to oust him during the next regular session. Before the legislature met in 1930, he needed to weed out as many enemies as he could. The most serious recall efforts targeted George Ginsburg and Horace Wilkinson. During a speech in Alexandria's Bolton High, Huey attacked Ginsburg, mocking the legislator as George Jackass Ginsburg. The next day, somebody, probably Huey, ordered a bale of hay and delivered it to Ginsburg. Because recalls were difficult to execute, none of the attempts to remove his enemies succeeded. When his opponents retaliated and initiated recall efforts against the Robineers and other pro-Long legislators, Huey agreed to a truce, and both sides canceled their recalls. The truce, arranged by his millionaire friend Harvey Couch, included a promise from Huey not to pursue the oil processing tax or increase business taxes, while the state's leading businessmen promised to use their influence to stop any renewal of impeachment proceedings. Nevertheless, Huey continued his reprisals, firing dozens of relatives of anti-Long legislators who still held state jobs. He was vindictive beyond description, remembered Ginsburg, who sat in the House for 6 weeks with a gun on his hip. Huey ruined me. I was director at the commercial bank. His examiners closed it. 3 years later, when Ginsburg faced re-election, Huey really unloaded on me and spent $25,000 to defeat him. Huey failed to recall Senator Don Labe, but later went to Lafayette and spoke against him at the courthouse. He accused Labe of accepting a new Ford from Standard Oil and, according to Maxine Roy, killed him as dead as a doornail. Labe, who opposed Huey, remembered, "You couldn't be independent. You had to be for him or against him." Labe realized Huey's opposition was too strong. "I didn't run in 1932. He would have beat me." While punishing his opponents, Huey rewarded his supporters. Each of the 15 Senate Robineers received a lucrative reward such as a state job, a judgeship, or state contracts. He appointed Lester Hughes as a $350 per month attorney for the Highway Commission. He gave a similar highway job to William Boone, a superstitious senator who would not sign the round robin as the 13th signer, but signed it as the 14th. Preacher Anderson, the senator found in an embarrassing position with a young woman, became Chief Enforcement Officer of the Highway Commission, and Senator Thomas Wingate, a cousin of Huey's from Vernon Parish, got another highway job. Robinier T.A. McConnell became chairman of the Fish and Oyster Division of the Conservation Commission. Huey appointed Senator Philip Gilbert as judge in the 23rd District, Fred Ozer as a New Orleans city judge, Hugo Dorr as a judge in the Circuit Court of Appeals, and other loyal legislators were rewarded. Fournette, besides being Speaker, also became a Highway Commission attorney, and Representative J.E. McCallahan was appointed warden of the state penitentiary. Round-robin signers who did not receive state jobs got their rewards in other ways. Senator F.E. Delahousse from the Iberia Parish, who carried the nickname Barrelhead because he demanded his payment on the barrelhead, probably received his reward in hard cash. Henry Larcade signed the round robin to get roads built around his Opelousas hometown. Larcade, from an area in Acadiana noted for bootlegging, supplied Huey with whiskey. I quit doing it because Huey drank too much. He would drink heavily at night until he passed out. Half a pint would put him out. Huey's rampant awarding of state jobs to his legislator friends later backfired. In February 1930, the state Supreme Court ruled that elected officials could not legally hold state jobs, throwing 16 of his legislators off the payroll. Undeterred by the ruling, Huey reinstalled all of them one by one into less visible positions of affluence and opportunity. Huey continued to show special loyalty to the senators who signed the round robin. When Lester Hughes' 9-year-old son died of leukemia, Huey drove from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, where he stayed up all night comforting Hughes and his families. He found the Gideon Bible and read from it as the sun rose. Later in the month, after the impeachment trial had ended, Huey invited all the Robiniers to join him on short vacation. The men piled into huge black placards and Cadillacs and raced southwest from New Orleans along the winding clamshell road that skirted the bank of the Bayou Lafourche. Several hours later, the road came to an abrupt halt as the village of Golden Meadow, there in front of Piccola's general merchandise store, they boarded a fishing boat. It was a steamy day and the sun screamed down, sweat already soaking the men's shirts. As the boat shoved off from the dock, Huey and the Robiniers howled and shot pistols in the air, many of them already drunk. Chugging south through the bayous, the boat ended up at Grand's Isle, the remote split of land that juts out into the Gulf of Mexico, where, according to Sidney Marchand, the mosquitoes were as big as grasshoppers. For the next few days, Huey treated the Robiniers to a hunting and fishing party where everyone picked apart fresh-caught crabs, boiling in huge cauldrons, soaked up his beer with whiskey, and tried to wash away the bitter taste of politics. I used to try to get things done by saying please, Huey said after surviving impeachment. That didn't work. Now I'm a dynamiter. I dynamite 'em out of my path. Now more than ever, acquiring absolute power consumed Huey. A man in a hurry, he employed almost any means to achieve his ends. I want power so I can do all the things I want to do, he admitted to a friend. Give me that militia and they can have all the laws they want. Much of his power rested on patronage, the thousands of state and local government jobs controlled by the governor. He increased his control of existing boards and bureaus, abolished the contrary ones, and then created new ones to do his bidding, while steadily increasing the state payroll with his supporters. With the Depression putting thousands of Louisianans out of work, state jobs became even more precious, and patronage an increasing powerful political tool. Huey hired extra game wardens, bridge tenders, state policemen, and added thousands of jobs with his huge road building program, with every new job securing at least one new vote. By 1931, Louisiana employed over 22,000 men working on highways, more than any other state in the country. Huey demanded that his organization be financially self-sufficient and not dependent on contributions from traditional political factions like the New Orleans Ring or business interests like Standard Oil. He funded his political organization with money given by wealthy supporters like Robert Mastry and Abe Shushan. and from the collection of deducts from state workers. State employees paid 5 to 10% of their salaries for upkeep of his political machine. If they refused to pay, the come or quit employees lost their jobs. He had to generate his own income to get the things done, instead of relying on the big business, thus being beholden to them. And then by creating numerous jobs, giving people work, and then also getting a 5 to 10% cut on the work that he gives out to pay back into the system to continue the system going. So just like he found ways around the local legislator and trying to get his own people into power, and by hook or by crook convincing other people to vote his way, he found a way to create his own income too, cutting out big business. And you can see why the newspapers and the big business and all the fat cats really hated this man. Huey replaced anti-long workers with crude and brutal finality. During the spring of 1930, he appointed Robert Mastry as chairman of the powerful Conservation Commission. However, the incumbent, Dr. Valin, refused to step down. When Huey issued an order suspending Valin, the doctor took the case to court. In November 1929, after the state Supreme Court refused to allow Dr. Valin's petition to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, Valin's employment was terminated. Learning of the court's decision, Huey mobilized 80 National Guard troops to oust Valin at bayonet point. "If I can't get him out any other way," he declared, "I'll get a corkscrew and screw him out." Before the soldiers arrived, Valin resigned. A few hours later, one of Huey's legislators appeared at the Conservation Commission's office in New Orleans and gathered the employees about him. The message he delivered from the governor was short: "You're all fired now." On a cool morning in late October 1929, Huey strode briskly through the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel after finishing his breakfast in the coffee shop and ran into Rudolph Hetch, president of the Hibernia Bank, a pillar of the New Orleans community. Hetch was one of the few businessmen friendly with Huey. "Governor, hell's broke loose," the banker said. "The biggest crash of everything that you've ever seen. It's going to be 60 days before this county will get back to normal." Hetch was alarmed, but he underestimated the seriousness of the stock market crash that had just occurred, when 16 million shares were sold at plummeting prices. The stock market crash ushered in staggering levels of unemployment, failing businesses and banks, drastically lowering agricultural prices, and for the next decade, economic disaster. At first, Louisiana appeared little affected, as the state had suffered for decades from its own form of chronic economic depression. Hopeless poverty always had overshadowed the state's pastoral beauty. By early 1930, however, even Louisiana began to feel the effects of the national crisis. Manufacturing in New Orleans declined by 50%, while the state's small farmers and small-town merchants suffered terribly. Over the next 3 years, Louisiana's annual per capita income declined from $415 to $222, and farm income fell from $170 million to $59 million. Louisiana's banks were especially vulnerable to the failing agricultural economy. During the early months of the Depression, Huey learned that a run had begun on the Bank of Lafayette and Trust Company, an important bank in the southwestern Louisiana sugar belt. Huey drove from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, where he met with the bank president in the Roosevelt Hotel. "Governor," the banker pleaded, "I've never been for you politically, but if you help save this bank, I'll be for you for life." Picking up the telephone, Huey called officials at the Federal Reserve Bank in New Orleans and delayed some of the fund clearances levied on the Lafayette Bank. This brought some time, but the bank was still in danger. Late that night, Huey and Seymour Weiss drove to Lafayette and arrived at the bank the next morning, just before its scheduled opening. Already a line of depositors waited at the door to withdraw their funds. Relaxing in the bank's president chair, his feet popped up on the desk, Huey called in the first person who came to withdraw his funds. The customer, a local lumberman holding a check to withdraw $18,000, was surprised to come face to face with the governor. "The state of Louisiana has $265,000 in this bank, and here's the state check for it," Huey told the customer. "There ain't about to be that much cash in the bank. And I was here before you were. You insist on drawing out $18,000, and I'll insist on drawing out the state's $265,000, and I'll get first draw, so there'll be nothing left to pay you. You agree to leave yours in, and I'll leave the state's money in, and nobody will be hurt. I'm staying right here to closing time at noon in case anyone else wants to draw out. The customer and those in line behind him had little choice but to leave their funds in the bank and depart. By the end of the day, Huey's brilliantly simple action gave the bank enough time to secure more loans and to stave off the run. So he kills the panic. Everyone goes to the bank to pull out their money. This happens every time there's a panic like this. Just through fortitude and cunning, he's able to stave off this panic, get the people to realize there's no reason to withdraw all your money. Everything's going to be okay. Just don't panic. And then keeps the bank up and running. And it also stops the crash from further affecting the community. Simply by just leveling with the people, by going there and leveling with the people. And you don't get this from modern politicians or governors or anyone else because they truly do not give a shit. They are not affected, no matter what happens to the community. Huey looked at things as a grander scale. Sure, did he enrich himself time to time? Sure. But did he enrich his state and the people that supported him? 100%. And were his motivations towards improving the life of poor people and the life of Louisianans? Of course. Besides the League, Louisiana's daily newspapers relentlessly attacked Huey. The Hammond Daily Courier, for example, published bitterly satirical editorials that referred to him as Screwy P. Swong, and the Baton Rouge State Times called him a little sniveling demagogue from Wynn. Huey fumed when the New Orleans Times-Picayune attacked him for putting prolonged legislators on the state payroll and drawing double salaries. Huey responded with another surprise move. He created his own newspaper. Starting a newspaper was not a new idea for Huey. In September 1917, while still a struggling young attorney, he investigated launching a newspaper in Winfield. He contacted a printer to see what a 4-page, 7-column weekly paper would cost, but soon dropped the idea. As governor, Huey finally realized his ambition on March 26, 1930, when he published the first issue of Louisiana Progress. The newspaper was an overnight success. He had no difficulty getting readership or financing, for he required all of his state workers to contribute part of their salary for subscription. Money from deducts also helped support the Progress, and Huey assigned female state workers from the Levee Board, Dock Board, and Board of Health to work on the paper. Papoose Root Beer and Winfield Rock Quarry, owned by Huey O.K. Allen and millionaire friend Harvey Couch, were among the businesses that bought ads. Huey hired John Kohler, a tall, balding night editor of the Times-Picayune, to manage his new newspaper. The Progress claimed a circulation of 125,000 weekly, including 30,000 copies sold in New Orleans. The first issue announced that Louisiana would prosper only if the state buries the fossils, run out the grafters, i.e. grifters today, run over the obstructionists, expose liars, keep its ears and eyes open, its tongue ready with opinion, its hands ready with the ballot. The front page displayed a large cartoon of Huey handing free school books to children. Huey described his newspaper as a weekly newspaper which proposes to cover the truth and the full truth about Louisiana affairs, its public business and its public officials, etc. He used the Progress as his personal soapbox to attack the state's large dailies. If the daily papers had their way, there wouldn't be any free school books, paved roads, or night classes for illiterates in Louisiana, an early Progress editorial spouted. These daily newspapers have been against every progressive step in this state, and the only way for the people of Louisiana to get ahead is stomp them flat. In yet another assault, Huey asked, "How long does it take you to read the New Orleans newspaper?" 15 minutes by the clock. Unless you read the ads, then it takes you an hour. It is a well-established newspaper precedent that the daily should contain twice as much reading matter than it does advertising. New Orleans papers have twice as much advertising as they have reading matter. The only reason you read them is because you don't want to miss what they're saying about me. Huey was not content with blasting the large daily newspapers with mere words. He vowed to put them out of business. During the regular legislative session in the summer of 1930, he proposed a 15% tax on all gross revenues received by Louisiana newspapers from advertising sales. Another bill allowed the state to use a court injunction to halt the printing of any newspaper that was obscene, lewd, or lascivious, or was malicious, scandalous, or defamatory. The outraged publishers of the dailies fought back and denounced Huey's proposed legislation as an opinion-smothering gag law and a padlock of the free press. Yeah, the same tripe they go on about today about those quote-unquote free press. On June 21, 1930, 46 newspapermen from across the state met in Baton Rouge to develop a strategy to fight his anti-newspaper bills. Charles Manship, publisher of the Baton Rouge newspapers and Huey's archenemy, convened the meeting. The publishers put heavy pressure on the legislature and their efforts paid off. On June 26, the Ways and Means Committee of the House voted against the newspaper advertising tax. Despite Huey's last-minute attempt to salvage the measure by lowering the tax rate from 15% to 5%, the newspaper gag injunction bill also died a quiet death in the State Judiciary Committee. A year later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that a Minnesota gag injunction law similar to Huey's was unconstitutional. Huey worked hard to strengthen his support in the Senate. He pressured senators to elect prolonged member Allen O. King of Lake Charles as president of pro tempore to replace Philip Gilbert, who had been appointed to the bench. Huey's strong-arm tactics worked, as 7 senators who voted for his impeachment now joined him. These included J.O. Fernandez, an old regular from New Orleans who testified during the impeachment trial that Huey tried to bribe him. Known as Bathtub Joe because he got rid of unwelcome callers with the excuse he was taking a bath, Fernandez sensed Huey's resurgence and switched allegiances. Fernandez planned to run for U.S. Congress in the next election and negotiated a deal with Huey. Huey also increased his support in the House, where he convinced 14 representatives who voted for impeachment to switch to his side. Huey was confident he could recapture much of the control he possessed before Bloody Monday, while his earlier effort to recall anti-law legislators collapsed. His subsequent campaign to win local elections succeeded, and his candidates won 21 seats in the lower house in the 1930 election. Huey now could count on a majority of the House to support his less controversial bills, but he still lacked a 2/3 majority necessary to pass constitutional amendments and bond issues. He would need 2/3 to finish building his roads. When Huey took office in 1928, Louisiana funded its pitiful road system with a 2-cent gasoline tax, road district property taxes, and a few $1,000s of federal aid. At the time, the state had just over 300 miles of paved highways and 5,728 miles of gravel gumbo roads. Most were in terrible condition. The trip on the River Road from New Orleans to Baton Rouge took 4 or 5 hours, a journalist remembered, and you usually had 4 or 5 punctures on the way. In 1928, Huey funded his $30 million road building program by selling bonds secured by a small increase in the gasoline tax. Now, 2 years later, he proposed to spend $68 million to complete a modern highway system. His long-term goal was for the state to possess 2,500 miles of concrete road, 1,300 miles of asphalt, and 9,600 miles of gravel under state maintenance. Before the regular session convened in 1930, he toured the state and inspected the first set of roads completed. The concrete highways built with 1928 bonds resembled a spiderweb running a few miles out from the parish seats, then ending abruptly in a long gravel road. Huey designed the incomplete highway pattern to whet the appetite of the voters for good roads in their parishes. We have started on the road system by scattering the work through the parishes, putting 5, 10, or 15 miles to the parish, Huey wrote. When the people once knew the pleasure of traveling over paved highways, their support for a program to connect up the links was certain. Our enemies were quick to see the plan and attacked us bitterly for it. We persisted in our plan. None ever worked better. Huey knew the political value of roads, especially with isolated truck farmers and sharecroppers who lived far from railroad lines and needed roads to deliver their goods to the market. On July 16, 1930, Highway Department trucks and state police cruisers carted the latest editions of Huey Long's Louisiana Progress across the state. When the paper arrived on doorsteps that morning, the huge banner headline across the paper shocked many of its readers. Huey was running for United States Senator. His announcement puzzled many Louisianans since he still had 2 years left as governor, and he had pledged during his inauguration to serve without ambition for ever holding another public office. Now Huey explained that he was running for the Senate to use the campaign as a referendum for his bonds issues for the roads and a new state capital. Because the legislator denied the people the chance to vote on his plans, he decided to bypass the legislator, go directly to the people, and use the Senate campaign to allow them to show their support of his programs. If he lost, Huey promised he would resign as governor. By jumping into the fight for Huey Long's political life, he took a calculated risk. Huey Long has piled all the chips on the table to bet on one throw of the dice. One anti-Long newspaper observed, "Win this time and we'll be through with him." Huey knew that if he lost the race, his political career was probably finished. But his political ambition had begun to expand beyond Louisiana, and he judged that the timing was right to run for Senate. He could not run for governor again, and his opponent in the Senate race, the incumbent Joseph Ransdell, was old and vulnerable. Huey did not wish to wait until he finished his term as governor in 1932 and run against the other more formidable senator, Edwin Broussard. Huey announced that if elected senator, he would remain as governor until he completed his term. Ransdell's term would expire in 1931, and Huey would end in May 1932. During the 14-month period, the Senate slot would remain vacant, although, as Huey pointed out, the Senate would be in session for only 4 of those months. He added that there was a precedent for holding 2 offices, as other governors in recent years, including David Hill of New York, Robert Laforte in Wisconsin, and Hiram Johnson in California, waited until their gubernatorial terms expired before taking their seats in the Senate. Huey's opponent, Senator Joseph Ransdell, was a 72-year-old slow-witted attorney from East Carolina Parish. Tall and thin, his gaunt face adorned with a white gold tee reminiscent of the Civil War era, Ransdell was a relic of past politics. He had been in Washington for 32 years, serving as a congressman since 1899 and senator since 1912. Ransdell was backed by the New Orleans Ring and the Anti-Long Constitutional League. At a New Orleans banquet for flood control, Congressman on July 14th, Huey introduced Ransdell as one of my oldest and dearest friends. Huey's early promise to refrain from personal attacks on his opponent did not last long. Soon after his announcement to run, Huey, who was 4 years old when Ransdell was first elected to Congress, charged that the old senator was too senile and too old to purchase life insurance. He began poking fun at Ransdell's gold tee by branding the gruff politician as Old Feather Duster and Old Trashy Mouth. Huey's run for Senate ignited a firestorm. All 18 of Louisiana daily newspapers, not surprisingly, supported Ransdell and berated Huey. On Tuesday, September 9, 1930, Huey Long won the Democratic primary election for U.S. Senator, trouncing the incumbent, Senator Ransdell, 149,640,000 to 111,451,000. Huey carried 53 of the 64 parishes. As expected, Huey won by a landslide in the rural regions, where 60% of Louisianans lived. However, he faltered in the larger cities. He lost New Orleans by 4,600 votes, but raised his raw vote in the Crescent City from 17,819 in 1928 to 35,599. He also lost his hometown Shreveport and the state capital. The hatred between Huey and the Baton Rougeans showed in the ballot box, where Ransdell won handedly 7,578 to 1,567. While Huey lost New Orleans, both his pro-Long candidates won congressional seats in the city over their Choctaw opponents. Bathtub Joe Fernandez upset incumbent 1st District Congressman James O'Connor, and Paul Mahoney, whom Huey previously backed for mayor, won the 2nd District congressional seat. Another Longite, Numa Monlet, won the 3rd District in the race for the northern member of the Public Service Commission. The Long candidate Harvard Fields defeated Huey's boyhood friend, now bitter enemy, Harley Bozeman. In October 1930, Secretary of State James Bailey died with 3 years remaining in his term. Huey surprised even his closest confidants when he appointed his 24-year-old secretary Alice Lee to the vacant cabinet post. As Secretary of State, she would fill the highest office ever held by a woman in Louisiana. Huey's appointment of Alice Lee set many a gossipy tongue to wagging, a New Orleans newspaper reported. When I came up from New Orleans this morning, I didn't have the slightest idea I'd have a new job, Alice Lee told the newspaper reporter, adding, I'll probably have a little time now to do the dances and play some golf and tennis. A year later, Huey planned a dance at his mansion in honor of Alice Lee, but canceled the event last minute when Rose became sick with the flu. Walmsley swept 14 of the city's 17 wards and won the mayoral victory over Francis Williams. As mayor, he became the nominal leader of the Old Regulars, who won all the seats of the city commission. The Choctaws gave Walmsley a new Pierce Arrow sedan as a token of their political alliance. Walmsley immediately became a bitter enemy of Huey Long. During the first of many disputes, the new mayor called Huey a madman, anarchist, liar, tyrant, usurper, and self-seeking demagogue. Walmsley's hatred, however, created a problem in the New Orleans political ranks after Huey won the Senate election in September of 1930. New Orleans bankers and businessmen knew Huey now held a tight grip on the legislature and believed that a war between the mayor and the governor would only worsen economic conditions. New Orleans needed financial help from the state government to solve its growing problems, especially its decrepit streets and sewers, burdensome debt of the port, and a city that owed over $3 million. Led by banker Rudolph Hetch, city leaders pressured Walmsley to make a deal with Huey. On Thursday, September 11th, just 2 days after Huey won a Senate election, Walmsley met with Huey in his 12th floor suite in the Roosevelt. Other Choctaw political leaders, bankers, lawyers, businessmen, and the old regular clerk of the city council traveled along with the mayor. Walmsley and his allies were ready to barter, but Huey was obstinate, knowing that he held the high cards. He controlled the legislature, a large number of patronage jobs in the city, and only 2 days before, his candidates for Congress, Bathtub Joe Fernandez, Paul Mahoney, and Numa Monette, had defeated the Ring candidates. Huey had a stranglehold over the old regulars, knew it, and drove a hard bargain. He is always trying to trade us a biscuit for a barrel of flour, Walmsley complained later. Huey refused to give up any patronage or elected offices to the Choctaws. Getting nowhere, Walmsley finally gave up. We've accepted your proposition, said the mayor. We're ready to go through. Leaning back in his chair and puffing on a huge cigar, Huey accepted Walmsley's surrender. The old regulars agreed to support Huey's entire program, including building his huge network of modern highways, constructing a new state capitol, and dropping any impeachment charges still pending in the legislature. Huey agreed to help repair the city's streets and sewers and refinance the port, but he refused to give the Choctaws any political concessions that would diminish his own power. He was confident that he could control and, if necessary, conquer the disorganized Choctaws. It has been my good fortune to have blind men like these in politics, he wrote later. They cannot see something after it has passed over them, and they have been knocked down by it half a dozen times. Once Huey made his deal with Walmsley, all of the New Orleans state legislators shifted to the Long camp. Other delegates, including some fence-sitters and those who voted for impeachment, conceded and joined Huey. With a twist of vengeance, Huey ordered the old regulars to strip John Sullivan, the traitor who had returned to the old regulars as lowly Third Ward leader, of any Ring office. Bangtail Sullivan, the maverick politician, gambler, and one-time Long supporter, faded into obscurity. The alliance among Huey, Walmsley, and the Choctaws created an unprecedented concentration of power, patronage, and political muscle. The new pact worried opposition leaders like Gus Williams, a rebellious New Orleans politician who opposed both Huey and the Ring. By joining forces, they hoped to secure a policy of political life insurance, Williams remarked, and at the same time create a monster political machine that will, at the people's expense, supply them and their henchmen with political graft for a generation to come. Overnight, Huey's victories altered the Louisiana political landscape. His power grew while his enemies were weakened. On the day after he won his landslide in the race for Senate, the Constitutional League, formed by ex-Governor Parker almost exactly a year before to prevent Huey P. Long from treating the organic law of the state as a scrap of paper, disbanded. When wealthy businessmen realized it was better to join Huey than fight him, they no longer funded the League and it collapsed. Just 5 days after Mayor Walmsley and the New Orleans surrendered to his demands, Huey Long called a special session of the legislature. With newfound political clout, he struck quickly to consolidate and strengthen his power. Starting at 8 in the evening on September 16, 1930, the representatives convened for 5 days in Baton Rouge. The session opened with an air of eerie peacefulness, a far cry from the fistfights and Billingsgate that had dominated recent sessions. With the legislature more firmly under his control, Huey ordered his bills introduced and voted in before his confused opposition could reorganize. On Thursday, September 18th, the House passed his $68 million road construction bill with only 12 opposing votes. The legislature approved increasing school funding, a 1-cent gasoline tax increase to refinance the Port of New Orleans, $5 million for a new Capitol building, and $7 million for a bridge spanning the Mississippi at New Orleans. When the House voted for Allen Ellender's motion to expunge all impeachment charges, 1 in 21 legislators voted against the resolution. A small number of legislators, including J.Y. Sanderson Jr., Massoy Spencer, and Cecil Morgan, refused to succumb to Huey. The most stubborn opponent was Huey's unrelenting nemesis, Judge Gilbert Dupree. Although elderly and deaf, Dupree could read the speaker's lips and follow the House proceedings by looking over the shoulder of newspaper reporters and reading their notes. The eccentric old French aristocrat slept in his clothes and shaved every night before retiring, one legislator recalled, supposedly so he could be prepared if he died in his sleep. Dupree was also unbending and combative, perpetually sparring with Huey's floor leaders. One day he entered a quarrel with Representative J. McCallahan with the challenge, "We'll order pistols and coffee for 2. Huey, who took a curious liking to Judge Dupree because of his feistiness, enjoyed getting the old man's goat. Huey came up from behind and mimicked the old legislator. Soon it dawned on Dupree that people were smiling at the wrong time. He turned and put his finger in Huey's face. A House member remembered and ordered him off the floor of the House and threatened to get a pistol and shoot him. Before the House voted on the proposal to construct a new state capitol, Huey walked to the back row of the chamber where Dupree sat at his desk and wrote on the old man's pad, "Are you going to vote for the new capitol?" Dupree shouted back an angry no. Huey took the pad and wrote again, "Die, damn you, in the faith." According to Huey, Dupree just smiled and almost came over to vote for the bill. Soon after, Huey ordered one of his workers, E.J. Oakes, to climb onto the Capitol roof and remove a couple of slates precisely above Dupree's desk. Every time it rained, which happened often in muggy Baton Rouge, a steady trickle dribbled down upon the old fire breather's desk. So Dupree is pretty much like a Cato to a Caesar, staunch in his opposition and his position, and has self-honor built around it. In the midst of a special session, the legislature adjourned early in the afternoon so the members could board a train for New Orleans. Later that evening, they attended a testimonial banquet for Huey in the Roosevelt's ritzy Venetian room. The guests included Mayor Walmsley, the old regular captains, and the uptown elite. Many of the same men who refused to attend the banquet held for Huey soon after his election. 600 men and 1 woman, Rose Long, his wife, filled the smoky hall stuffed with flowers and sumptuous food. Walmsley appeared to bury the political hatchet when he gave Huey a warm and enthusiastic introduction. "Even in the hour of our defeat," the mayor remarked, "we feel that he has stretched to us a hand of friendship for the good of the state." Taking the rostrum after the glowing introductions, Huey delivered a 3-hour speech promising to provide the city with $700,000 to repair New Orleans' decrepit streets and antiquated sewers, construct a huge $3 million modern airport, and build a $7 million span across the Mississippi to be aptly named the Huey P. Long Bridge. Huey thanked the previous speakers for the praise they gave him, but suggested they might have gone too far in their glowing testimony. He then told them a story of a man in Wynn Parish who died, leaving behind a wife and mother-in-law. At the funeral, the preacher described in great flowery detail the attributes of the deceased. Each time the preacher added another tribute to the dead man, the mother-in-law stood, walked over to the casket, peeked in, and returned to her seat. After she did this several times, the minister turned to the woman and asked her if there was anything he could do to relieve her grief. "I just want to stand here," the woman replied, "to be sure the man you're talking about is my son-in-law." So even as his old enemies are stroking the hell out of him, he's like, yeah, okay, calm down, guys. At about the time of the Senate election, Huey acquired a new nickname. He began calling himself the Kingfish, taken from a character who was the leader of the Mystic Knights of the Sea in a popular radio comedy, Amos and Andy. The nickname sarcastically fit Huey, often answered the telephone simply with, "This is the Kingfish." The nickname also helped lighten his more serious business of controlling Louisiana. It had served as a substitute gaiety for some of the tragedy of politics, Huey wrote later. "I have made no effort to discourage it." His critics, however, saw the new nickname as a choice opportunity to belittle him. Vanity Fair, for example, said that the Louisiana Kingfish had a big mouth, feeds off suckers, thrives best in mud and slime, and is very hard to catch. On November 4th, 1930, after the special session of the legislature concluded, the voters of Louisiana overwhelmingly passed all of Huey's constitutional amendments, including his new road building program. During the following summer, he forced Walmsley in the ring to allow him to select his own candidates in 8 state house races and 3 Senate races, all in the New Orleans area, leaving the remaining 9 House and 5 Senate contestants to the Choctaws. With these New Orleans representatives added to his roster of pro-long, rural, and Acadiana legislators, Huey now maintained a majority control over the legislature and close to 2/3 vote necessary for funding bills and changes to the state constitution. On August 8, 1931, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued its annual cotton crop forecast. The farmers of the cotton-growing states dreaded the August report, for it usually confirmed a dangerous increase in production and a ruinous decrease in prices. The report was worse than expected and forecast 16 million bales for the 1931 crop year, the 3rd largest yield in history. The bumper crop added to a huge on-hand surplus of 8 million bales from the previous year, foretold catastrophe for cotton farmers. 24 million bales would be available for 1931, but the annual worldwide cotton consumption was only 12 million. With twice the amount of cotton needed on the market, prices plummeted. Cotton prices averaging 40 cents a pound in 1920 and dropping to 20 cents a pound in 1927 now averaged an unthinkable 4 cents a pound by the late summer of 1931. The cotton industry, a victim of an enormous surplus, an economy mired in depression and shrinking world markets, now searched for answers to stave off economic disaster. The U.S. Department of Agriculture recommended that farmers immediately plow under every 3rd row of cotton to eliminate the surplus. But state governments and farmers rejected the federal plan as impractical. The federal government then declared that it was the obligation of the governors of cotton-growing states to take action. Of the governors, only Huey Long immediately responded. His plan was not the only one dealing with the crisis, but it was the simplest and most drastic. He called for a 1-year ban on all cotton production. Huey believed that a 1-year moratorium would create a flurry of buying that could double the price and enable farmers to earn enough in 1931 to row over the banned year of 1932. If the people adopted his plan, he predicted the South would see 20-cent cotton in 3 weeks. "Hold your cotton," Huey urged Southern planters, "and my cotton holiday plan will boost the price so you won't lose any money and won't have to make a crop in 1932. On August 16th, Huey telegraphed senators, governors, and congressmen from cotton states and invited them to a conference in New Orleans 5 days later. Of the 12 governors invited, only the governors of Arkansas and South Carolina showed up, but the others all sent representatives. When the delegates met at the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, Texas proposed to reduce cotton production by 50% in 1932, but all the attendees voted down the plan. Instead, they overwhelmingly endorsed Huey's plan. The ban would not be binding unless these states produced 3/4 of the cotton also passed similar legislation. The stipulation meant that Texas, which harvested 1/3 of the total crop, had to agree or the plan failed. However, Texas Governor Ross Sterling opposed Huey's plan. "It's Governor Long's baby," Sterling decried. "Let him wash it first." At 10 in the evening, on Tuesday, August 25th, Huey convened the Louisiana legislature for a 6-day special session. Wearing a white cotton suit, he took to the rostrum and personally guided the proceedings. He had 2 of his opponents propose the cotton holiday legislation to show that his plan had wide endorsement, including that of Mayor Walmsley and most of Huey's enemies. Only one representative spoke against the cotton holiday plan. Old Judge Dupree rose from his seat and argued that the plan to ban cotton production was unconstitutional. One of Huey's supporters jumped up to challenge Dupree, turning to his colleagues and asking, "Hell, if the government can tell a man what he can't drink, why can't they tell him what he can't plant?" 2 days later, the House passed the plan 77-0, and the Senate followed the next day 32-0. Dupree abstained. That night at 1:30 in the morning, Huey signed the bill in his bedroom in the governor's mansion. Sitting on cotton bedsheets and wearing a cotton nightshirt, "Now I can take this damn thing off," he told his aides as soon as the photographers departed, and climbed back into his silk pajamas. No one irritated Huey Long more than Paul Sierre. After the Louisiana Progress attacked Sierre for abandoning Huey, the lieutenant governor sent a telegram to the editor of the Progress, John Kohler, and called him a liar and a poltroon. The bitter exchange was just enough to rekindle the smoldering animosity between Louisiana's 2 highest-ranking officials. On March 4, 1931, Senator Ransdell's term expired and the Senate office became vacant. Huey, whose gubernatorial term would not end until May 1932, refused to assume the Senate office until his successor as governor was in place. Hostile newspapers, Huey's opponents, and especially the lieutenant governor demanded that Huey step down and go to Washington to take his seat. Throughout that spring and the summer of 1931, Dr. Sierre threatened to take the oath of office as governor. Huey had been reluctant to leave the state since February 1929, when he and Sierre split over the Dreher-LaBeouf murder case. And that was a case over where a wife and her lover killed the husband, and Ada LaBeouf became the first white woman to be killed by execution in Louisiana, and I believe the 7th overall in America. And the death warrant was signed by Huey Long when he was governor. He feared that Sierre would decimate the Long political machine if he became acting governor in his absence. Governor, senator-elect, and prisoner in his own state, read the headline of a St. Louis newspaper on March 22, 1931. On one occasion, Sierre learned that Huey had spent the night in Jackson, Mississippi, and headed for Baton Rouge to take over. Huey rushed back, crossing the state line in time to send a telegram saying he was safely back on Louisiana soil just before Sierre entered the capital city to seize the governor's office. After Huey sent National Guardsmen to surround the capital with machine guns, Sierre gave up. So Sierre tried his little power move there, because I guess you can get into, take the office over if he's out of state. So Huey Long sends down the National Guard, and they hold it down with machine guns, keeping him out so he can get back over state line and secure his position. See, it's a well-oiled machine now. You don't see them allowing people like Huey Long back into the political system. So they make sure just to have sterilized and superficial politicians, that'll play the game between Republican and Democrat. That fall, Huey canceled plans to travel to West Point for the LSU football game. He blamed Sierre, who refused to sign a document promising not to take the oath of office if Huey left the state. Sierre gave a verbal promise not to take power, but Huey would accept only a written one. For months, Huey had planned to accompany the LSU student body on a cross-country train excursion on their way to the military academy, but he did not make the trip. On November 7, 1931, a furious Huey stayed in Louisiana while 1,700 LSU students traveled to West Point and watched Army beat LSU 20-0. Dr. Sierre filed a suit in early October to oust Huey as governor. On October 14th, the dentist declared himself governor and had a Shreveport justice of the peace give him the oath of office in the Caddo Parish Courthouse. Sierre insisted that Huey had vacated the office upon being elected senator. "I want Huey Long to get out of office as soon as possible," said Sierre, "so I can go in and straighten up this state and put an end to this debauchery." When Sierre arrived in Baton Rouge and threatened to take over the mansion, Huey raced from New Orleans to the Capitol. Chuck Frampton, a New Orleans Items newspaper reporter, was with Huey. As they left, the governor stuck a gun in his belt. Huey was deathly opposed to guns, and he didn't drive much, Frampton remembered. "We got in the low-slung special-built Cadillac, and we drove to Baton Rouge in less than an hour. My heart was in my mouth. With Huey driving 90 and 100, I thought he was crazy." When Huey arrived to the Capitol, he ordered the National Guard to mobilize. Troops again surrounded the Capitol with strict orders not to admit the lieutenant governor. Within a few days, state police replaced guardsmen. "It was an armed camp," recalled one of Huey's supporters. Doc carried a gun and Huey carried a gun. Huey, taking no chances, also ordered the 4 LSU football players who were living at the mansion at the time to stay home from class and throw Sierre out on North Street if he showed up. Dr. Sierre realized he was beaten again and returned to his home and dental practice in Jeanerette. Huey was not finished with Sierre, however. He argued that Sierre, by taking the oath of governor, had vacated the lieutenant governorship, and since his oath for governor was illegal, he held neither job. "Taking the oath of office as governor ends Dr. Sierre," Huey declared. "He is no longer lieutenant governor, and he is now nothing." Huey appointed one of his loyal legislators, Senator Alvin O. King, as lieutenant governor and ordered that Sierre no longer receive salary from the state. On November 3rd, Huey traveled to Shreveport and argued for an hour and a half to convince a Shreveport court that Dr. Sierre's claim to the governorship was baseless. Huey contended that several other governors had delayed their Senate appointment while finishing their gubernatorial terms. He also argued that the courts could not remove a governor and that the qualifications for a U.S. senator could only be determined by the U.S. Senate. He was persuasive. For 2 weeks later, Caddo District Judge T.F. Bell dismissed Sierre's suit to oust Huey as governor. Huey Long and most other Louisianans agreed with the pro-Long Bineville Democrat that Sierre had about as much chance of being installed or elected governor of Louisiana as a Texas billy goat had of making a non-stop jump to the planet Mars. So that's some shrewd political maneuvering there. He gets Sierre out of, not only stops him from taking over as governor, but gets him out of lieutenant governor now too. Completely broke the man, and simply saying, hey, because he tried to, declare himself governor, he's no longer valid as lieutenant governor either. And he puts his loyal friend in there, old O.K. Allen. So, yeah, that's some top-notch political maneuvering there. Of all of Huey Long's supporters, none was more loyal than Oscar Kelly Allen. Silver-haired, friendly, and harmless. In late 1931, Huey neared the end of his 4-year term as governor and, needing to pick a successor who would carry out his bidding, turned to his old friend Oscar to run for governor in the upcoming January 1932 election. Allen, 11 years older than Huey, grew up in poverty on a farm 3 miles from Huey Long's spread in Winfield, taught in a country school, and later managed a sawmill and opened his own small store. Voters elected him Wynn Parish assessor in 1916. In 1918, he borrowed $500 from a Winfield bank to help finance Huey's first campaign for railroad commissioner, and from then on he was completely devoted to Huey. O.K. was elected to the state senate in 1928. At the same time, Huey became governor. Shortly afterwards, Huey appointed him chairman of the Highway Commission. Along with O.K. Allen running for governor, Huey's Complete the Work ticket included John Fournette running for lieutenant governor, Gaston Portery for attorney general, and a full slate of his supporters for the other elected offices. and a full slate of his supporters for the other elected officers. Because several of the offices up for election sat on the powerful state board of liquidation, Huey ensured that he controlled every contest. He selected Allen Ellender to succeed Fournette as Speaker of the House and also serve as campaign manager for the ticket, although Huey continued to decide on the smallest details. When Huey picked Fournette to run for lieutenant governor, he created a nasty split within his own family. His brother Earl wanted to run for the post and asked Huey for his endorsement. Huey and Earl had always had a love-hate relationship. As children, they were close, slept in the same room, and played together. But the brothers constantly competed. Tall, lean, and graceful, Earl was slower mentally but stronger physically than Huey and aspired to follow in his brother's footsteps. Huey was fond of Earl, but Earl tended to be jealous of Huey, a Long supporter remembered, adding that the brothers split and reconciled several times. Those Longs are like a bunch of quail. They flutter up and beat at each other, but when it's over, they settle back together. When Huey chose Fournette, Earl blew up and decided to run anyway. Huey's older brother Julius campaigned energetically for Earl, and the entire Long family backed Earl. When the race for governor started in the summer of 1931, Allen faced three opponents. George Guion, an upper-class lawyer from New Orleans with little political experience, ran on an honest government platform. Guion had little chance, for Huey still controlled the New Orleans vote after Walmsley and the old regulars surrendered to him a year before. Lieutenant Governor Paul Sierre also entered the governor's race. Huey pretended he was surprised when Sierre announced, remarking that Sierre should run for a race he can win, such as Justice of the Peace in Jeanneret. Sierre realized he had no chance of winning, withdrew, and endorsed Guion. The third opponent to enter the race for governor was Huey's antagonist, Dudley LeBlanc, the flamboyant Frenchman who served on the Public Service Commission without pay because Huey kept vetoing the commission's appropriations. LeBlanc had a small following in Acadiana, but his only organized support was Francis Williams' weak New Orleans faction. As soon as the campaign began, Dudley launched attacks that were almost as vicious and colorful as Huey's. "Why, if I had a cow as stupid and dumb looking as O.K. Allen," Dudley declared, "I'd take him out and cut his head off." LeBlanc accused Ellender, who owned a large farm, of selling inferior potatoes to the penitentiary at superior prices. Most of Dudley's ire, though, was aimed at Huey. He claimed he was running for governor to rid this state of Long and all his blood-sucking, tax-eating, bribe-giving, and bribe-taking crowd. Dudley branded Huey as a cowardly slacker for not serving in the military during World War I. "I now call upon those buddies who fought with me in the trenches for 14 long months to go to the polls and vote for me," LeBlanc urged his audience. Dudley bent the truth as he was drafted into the Army in 1918 for only 5 months and never went overseas. LeBlanc wasn't even kicked by a mule or bit by a horsefly, Huey charged back. While OK was a candidate for governor, the race was still about Huey. Earl called his brother the yellowest physical coward that God had ever let live, and dared big-bellied Huey to meet him face-to-face in front of the Roosevelt Hotel. Huey struck back. "Earl is my brother, but he is crooked. If you live long enough, he'll double-cross you. He'd double-cross Jesus Christ if he was down here on the earth." LeBlanc tried to imitate Huey and started his own newspaper, the Louisiana News. First published from Lafayette in May 1932 and costing 25 cents a year, Dudley's News was created for the purpose of the exposure of political crooks. Because he was unable to force state workers to subscribe, LeBlanc's paper never achieved success. While he pictured himself in the same role as Huey, Dudley possessed neither the guile nor the determination of Huey. The Louisiana political arena was too small for two such characters, and Huey shared his stage with no one. The voters swept most pro-Long legislators into office. 28 out of the 86 members of the House who sought re-election were defeated, most of them anti-Longs, with the other anti-Long representatives deciding not to run for re-election when they discovered that Huey's machine was just too powerful. To the displeasure of most of the Long family, Huey's candidate, John Fournette, defeated his brother, Earl, for lieutenant governor. So this is all a vote for Huey Long. All his people, I mean, this is how you take over a local state government, if you're a character like Huey Long. You know, he tells everyone, here's my candidate, here's my candidate, here's my candidate. They're all going to support whatever I try to pass, and then the people vote for them. Voting essentially for Huey Long. Essentially voting him into dictatorship of Louisiana. Not only do they vote for him, but they vote for his people. Whether they're professionals or skilled or not in these positions, it doesn't matter. They know they're going to support whatever Huey tries to pass, and the people were very much in favor for the laws Huey was trying to pass. Some of Huey's opponents chose not to challenge his increasingly powerful and well-financed political machine. One of his die-hard enemies who decided not to run was the venerable Judge Gilbert Dupree, the contrary deaf old legislator. Dupree decided to abandon the House seat, so you remember him from earlier, would never vote for anything to do with Huey because he just saw him as corrupt or wrong, and like I said, he was essentially the Cato to Caesar. Dupree decided to abandon the House seat he had held since 1888 when he learned that his son-in-law, Dr. Octave Pavey, would oppose him in the upcoming election. Dupree knew he had no chance. The ruling Creole families of St. Landry Parish, including the powerful Paveys, switched allegiance to Huey after he promised to build a state road through Opelousas, their quaint French-American parish seat. Penniless, Dupree looked for employment. In a sad twist of politics, Huey took pity on his old nemesis and hired Dupree as a columnist for the Louisiana Progress. Dupree's articles were as vitriolic as his former speeches in the House, although he now aimed his attacks at Huey's opponents instead of Huey. Heralded by the Progress as one of the most capable barristers of the state, Dupree later defended Huey's attempt to tax the state's large newspapers. Whether the papers should be taxed is debatable, Dupree wrote, but to argue that taxing them was an assault on the freedom of press is rot, pure and simple. On Thanksgiving Day, 1931, shortly after he went to work at the Progress, Dupree was back in Opelousas, and while crossing the main street ran into his friend Charlie Dejean, a 40-year-old salesman. Dejean stopped Dupree and wrote on the deaf man's pad, "You thought Allen was a crook 3 months ago. What do you think of him now?" Dupree, still proud and stubborn at 72, exploded at Dejean's suggestion that he was a hypocrite. The judge walked back to his home a couple of blocks away and stuck his .38 revolver in his belt. He returned to the town square, rounded the corner near the courthouse, and again ran into Dejean. Dupree pulled out his revolver and shot Dejean in the stomach. The man died on the spot. So that's that old school honor right there. You're not going to besmirch my character. It kind of shows you who Huey was as well. Here you have this Cato compared to Caesar, and if you don't get the reference, he was just a stubborn man stuck in his politics of old, as this revolutionary dictator figure came around, and he just constantly was antagonistic and not receptive to his message. So you have this person, Dupree, being that kind of character, and then when he's down on his luck now, he's no longer a government servant, and obviously not a crooked man because he's poor after government service. How many people are in government service as long as he was and leave poor? Like, you could tell this wasn't a corrupt man, and he had a certain pride. And it came out when this guy tried to insult his pride and called him a hypocrite. He shot him dead for that. That's kind of the penalty paid for disrespect of a man's character in the good old days. But it shows you what kind of person who he was. He gave this person a job because he had sympathy for him, because he had respect for him, even though he was on the other side of the aisle so often against him. And his sympathy doesn't stop there. Let's go on. Huey felt sympathy for Dupree and hired Austin Fontenette, the long leader in the parish and shrewd attorney, to defend the old man. Dupree claimed self-defense, arguing that "I couldn't physically fight a man of that size." A parish court acquitted Dupree of the murder. Huey later appointed Fontenette district attorney to replace another St. Landry enemy, Lee Garland. So there you go. He even, gets a lawyer in there, and probably in a parish totally on Huey Long's side, and gets this man off on the crime as well. On a wintry afternoon late January 1932, Senator Jim Watson of Indiana, the stodgy and stiff Republican leader of the United States Senate, relaxed near his desk. Watson was startled when a stranger spun him around, slapped him sharply on the chest with an open hand, and introduced himself. "Jim, I want to get acquainted with you." Staggered by the blow, Watson asked, "Well, who the hell are you?" The stranger loudly answered, so all could hear, "I am Huey Long." How can you not love this guy? Several days before, Huey decided that the time was right to take his seat in the U.S. Senate. With O.K. Allen elected to succeed him as governor, Huey could depart Baton Rouge and proceed to Washington. Wearing a flashy polka dot tie and a gigantic gladiola in the lapel of his swanky charcoal suit, Huey refused to let a driving rainstorm dampen the spirit of his departure. When the train stopped in Atlanta, Huey stepped from the coach for some fresh air. He looked surprisingly relaxed. "I'm going to get an education in Washington," he told a reporter standing on the platform. "This is the first time in 5 years that my blood pressure has been normal. Why, I've been sleeping with 4 telephones in my bedroom." At 4 in the morning on January 25th, Huey arrived in Washington and checked into the Mayflower Hotel with several of his ever-present bodyguards. Later that day, after smacking Senator Watson on the chest, he took the oath as United States Senator. Although he occupied the seat once used by venerable Senator John C. Calhoun, Huey was unimpressed by the Senate's tradition and flouted its hidebound protocol. On the first day, he sauntered onto the floor wearing a gray double-breasted suit and smoking a large cigar, a violation of the Senate's no-smoking policy, and placed the smoking stogie on a senator's desk while he held up his hand to take the oath of office. See, that's how a wrecking ball comes into the Senate. Not calling all of your enemies like friends and good people all of a sudden, but he is who he is. It's not going to change because he's in this position. Now, if he's got to work some people and smother them up and, bribe them, he can definitely do that. But he's going to be him. He never hid his ambitions and the political policies he believed in and who he was fighting for, which was the common person. People that try to portray Huey Long as someone who was just out for himself are heavily misled, because if it was just wealth and power he wanted, he could have had that and kept it in Louisiana. But no, that was not enough. That was not enough. Because he saw, and I think he learned, that you can only do so much in your state when the federal government is so much against what you're doing. So in order to get a bigger power off your back, you have to become that bigger power. And he felt, and as we'll get on later into his story, as he started getting his ambitions for running for president, he definitely felt that his message that won the people over in Louisiana, especially working class and lower working class people, and people even in poverty, that how that message got over in Louisiana, it can get over in America as well. We go on. On that day, he snubbed another old enemy, the senior senator from Louisiana, Edwin Broussard. Huey had stumped for Broussard in 1926 against J.Y. Sanders, but since that time, the two hated each other. In 1931, Broussard demanded that Huey resign as governor and take his seat in the Senate, dubbing him the worst governor Louisiana ever had. Normally, the senior senator would introduce the new senator from his home state to his colleagues. Neither Huey nor Broussard were on speaking terms, so Senator Joe Robinson of Arkansas escorted Huey into the chamber. By the time Huey arrived in Washington, the 72nd Congress had been meeting for 2 months. Over the next 5 months, he enraged his colleagues with an abysmal attendance record. He rarely attended any committee meetings, and of the 137 days that remained in the session, he was absent for 81. Later that year, Senator David Reed, a Pennsylvania Republican, already repulsed by Huey's brash style, reprimanded him for repeated absences from the Senate. When Huey did show up, he exasperated his colleagues with political bluster and radical motions. On April 4th, 1932, he took the Senate floor and gave the first of many speeches calling for legislation to share the wealth, limit all fortunes to $100 million, and divide up the remaining millions among the poor. Titled The Doom of America's Dream, this speech was an aggressive critique of President Herbert Hoover's feeble economic policy. He quoted labor leader Samuel Gompers and philosopher John Dewey and provided statistics arguing that corporate monopoly and maldistribution of wealth were the root causes of the Depression. He warned there must be a drastic redistribution of wealth. There is no rule so pure as that one that the same mill that grinds out the fortunes above a certain size at the top grinds out paupers at the bottom, Huey declared. A week later, Huey introduced an anti-monopoly bill in the Senate and proposed 65% surtax on incomes greater than $2 million. And $2 million in his day, according to an internet search I just did, comes out to about $30 million today. So 65% tax on people making over $30 million a year. All his motions and resolutions gained little support from his colleagues, you don't say, and his bills to share the wealth never received more than 20 votes. The other senators begun to shun him. I don't believe he can get the Lord's Prayer endorsed in this body, one senator remembered. To Huey and many of his colleagues in the United States Senate, Joe Robinson was cooler than a fresh cucumber and sourer than a pickled one. A short-statured but solid Southern aristocrat who always wore a funeral black bow tie, Robinson was a senior senator from Arkansas, minority leader and powerful Democratic wheelhorse. Conservative, arrogant, and a stickler for the Senate's stuffy traditions, Robinson autocratically issued orders to the Democratic members and expected them to obey him blindly. He immediately detested the insubordinate new senator from Louisiana when Robinson and other conservative Democrats refused to support Long's amendment to limit annual incomes to $5 million. Which today would be $76 million. So limit annual income to $76 million. The rest goes into the state. And this was something that was on his presidential platform as well. Or was going to be. I'm sorry. Never got the chance. Where are we at? Okay, so incomes to $5 million. Huey attacked the Arkansas senator. As he had in past political fights, Huey continued to always hit the big man first. Rising on the Senate floor, waving his arms and clenching his fists, he insisted that the Senate immediately remove Robinson as minority leader. While his colleagues sat appalled at their desks, he suggested that the Democrat Robinson join Republican Hoover's campaign as his vice presidential running mate. Robinson and Hoover worked together for the same things, with the same ideas, and with the same results. He blamed the Depression on a conspiracy among Robinson, Hoover, financier Bernard Baruch, and Eugene Meyer, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank. Huey's attack became more personal when he read a list of Robinson's Arkansas corporate clients that represented every nefarious interest on the living face of the globe. He accused Robinson of getting rich from his Senate office. The Bible tells us that where a man's treasure is, there's his heart. When a man comes in the Senate without enough clients to make a corporal's guard and winds up representing every big corporate interest, if that does not mean something, what does? It was the epitome of bad taste and bad psychology. Senator Hattie Caraway wrote, Huey is making a spectacle of himself, of which he will be ashamed as he gains in years and wisdom. If At the end of his haranguing, a purple-faced Huey brushed back a lock of hair that kept falling in his face and turned to the presiding officer of the Senate. I send to the desk, Mr. President, my resignation from every committee that has been given to me by the Democratic leadership since I've been here. Huey's resignation of his committee assignments startled everyone. One newspaper reporter wrote that this act makes one think of a schoolboy who won't play on the school ball team because the players won't let him pitch. Senator Robinson belittled his performance as a comic opera performance unworthy of the great actor from Louisiana. The Washington Post called for Huey to resign from the Senate. When Huey realized his motions and speeches produced little result, he began a new strategy to wear out his opponents. On May 16th, he delivered a 3-hour filibuster in which he told some rather funny stories. With unlimited freedom to speak, Huey enjoyed his control over the Senate. "I am beginning to be convinced by the logic of my own argument," he declared. "I feel the urge to talk." As he gave his filibuster, he ignored the rule that senators should stand formally by his desk when he rose to speak. Instead, he wandered into the center aisles that divided the semicircle desks, approached the speaker's rostrum, and wove between the desks of his exasperated colleagues. Increasingly, he resorted to long-winded diatribes. In June, he delivered another filibuster, this time delaying a bill that increased income tax rates. As word of Huey's antics spread, crowds began to fill the Senate galleries each time he took the floor. Often his humorous barbs caused the spectators to laugh loudly. On one occasion, after a particularly scathing attack on one of his colleagues had the gallery roaring, the president officer threatened to clear the galleries if the laughter continued. During many of the sessions, one of the spectators was a tall, gawky Texan in his early 20s named Lyndon Johnson. Just arrived in Washington as an aide to a congressman, Johnson begged the Senate doorkeeper to call him whenever Huey was about to speak. "For leading the masses and illustrating your point humanely, Huey Long couldn't be beat," remembered the future president. "I was simply entranced by Huey Long." So there you go. He steps down from every committee, and they think, "Oh, look at him, he's taking his ball and going home." But no, he revamps and he comes back like how he always does, strong and hitting them right in the mouth. And people get a wind of this, and of course people are going to be attracted to Huey Long. He's a dynamic personality, and he's speaking for the interest of the people as well. So now he's having the Senate floor crowded with spectators, and they're laughing and cheering. And of course, the Senate is threatening to kick everyone out if they don't stop laughing. It just shows you his connection with people and how he was always in big fights with big business and doing things like calling out the Federal Reserve for the Depression. That'll wrap up part 1 of Huey P. Long's Life and Times. In part 2, we'll get into more of his Senate battles, more of him trying to control what's going on in Louisiana while he's also having fights in Washington, and then his challenging of FDR, and then his eventual plans to run for president, but being stopped short by an assassin's bullet.